Hello, my fellow Westorians. It's another edition of Valar Rereadis for the World of Ice and Fire, where we hone in on the world building, the very rich setting. What's triple rich? Is that... How many riches do you need to get wealthy? I don't know. But it's an amazing...
You need four. Triple's no big deal.
Okay. Well, then rich setting in which these characters we love exist. George has put a lot of work into his world, and so shall we. He wanted us all to have fun with it, and so we shall. Sean, what are you drinking today? What are you quenching your thirst on this fine Easter Sunday? It is Easter, everybody. Happy Easter if you celebrate or just want to shout out the fact that it's a holiday. That's what I'm doing. So, Sean, how are you enjoying your
Rabbit blood?
Rabbit blood. You are on point, my friend.
This is Rainbow Machine Naked Drink mixed with black cherry sparkling ice mixed with watermelon Mountain Dew.
Oh.
That's cool. That's cool, Sean. Weird and funny as usual. We've got some cool shirts today. Check me out. I've got We Do Not Flee, the King's Guard. Another Fox and Brambles product. Very nicely done, y'all.
Yeah, you can find more of her shirts on Redbubble and stickers on Etsy. Fox and Brambles.
Right on.
Was that originally We Do Not Betray, but then they had to change it because of Jamie?
No, it was We Do Not Flee with like an A, like the small biting insect.
They don't go in a flea bottom?
Right. We don't suck the blood off of farm animals and people. Yeah. Which is accurate.
Sean's got a nice shirt too today.
What's his say?
Timely shirt.
He's got the gang goes to Ice and Fire Con.
Oh, yeah. Heck yeah. Ice and Fire Con is this coming weekend, which is a good time to remind y'all there won't be a live Valar Rereadis next week. I will be releasing the next Winds of Winter full chapter audio, however. If you're a patron, you've already heard it. But if you're not, well, then you're going to have a little fun with that. You get to hear it. So... let's get to it. Shout out to our friend Nina, Good Queen Alley with 1L.tumblr.com. She has currently on her blog a cool post about the cloaks, the marriage cloaks at the purple wedding and the symbology behind it. It involves a take from our other good friend, Jim McGeehan, something like a lawyer. They're kind of collaborating a bit for this take. Good stuff. Check it out. Of course, Jim's over at Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire. I guess it's just Wars of A Song of Ice and Fire these days. That's on Tumblr, Wars of ASOIF. So say hey to Jim for us, too, if you go over there. All right. This episode was chosen by History of Westeros Patreon members and has coined our new name, the Sarnor Rule. We've been using polls to choose the topics each week recently, and Sarnor came in second 3 times in a row. That seemed like sufficient interest to me, especially because I really wanted to do this topic. So the Sarnor Rule will be invoked anytime we have an episode get second place 3 times. Doesn't have to be 3 in a row, but this one did. Now, we also do voting for scripted episodes for some of the higher dollar patrons, and those, of course, don't come out weekly, but they do come out whenever we finish them.
I'm surprised that you really wanted to do this topic, Aziz, because there's hardly any information in the document here.
Yeah, this might be the longest episode document we've had since Valar Rereadis for A Song of Ice and Fire. Those generated monstrous documents. These are not as large because we have more discussion points that we launch into, whereas there was just a lot more specific information written down for VRR for ASOIF. Yeah, we have a lot to talk about. Let's get to it, but we have to start with our traditional. Yes, it's a tradition now. That's right. It's a traditional trivia question at the beginning of the episode. The Kingdom of Sarnor was known for using chariots from very early times and never seemed to really stop. In later days, they were often richly decorated with precious metals and gems and artwork even. This is in great contrast to the free folk of the frozen shore who also ride chariots. But they're made primarily from the bones of what animal? What animal bones are used to make the chariots ridden by the free folk on the frozen shore? Answer at the end. And let's get to it. Sarnor So, Sarnor has a similar theme as seen in A Song of Ice and Fire in that there is a failure to unite against an existential threat. This, of course, we'll detail at the end. We'll move through this chronologically as much as possible, but of course, the doom of Sarnor, not quite like the doom of Valyria, but they sure did end pretty thoroughly. It took a little bit longer, but it was just as certain, just as final. And of course, thousands of years passed between the first city of the Tall Men and their eventual fall. It's a great story. George often mixes real-world history with inspirations from other authors. You've heard me say that before. And of course, he includes his own incredible imagination, his own expertise as an author. There's always an indeterminate mix of those three basic elements. And in this case, it's a good example of learning something along the way here. I like real-world history enough that I often recognize the parallels. And we have such a great group of people helping and commenting that a lot of times that helps fill in the gaps, or at least point me in the right direction, and then I can go do more reading or light research. But of course, as a person born in the West and living my whole life in the West, I tend to know more about European history than other places around the world. And there's obviously various reasons for that. It's pretty normal. But I have fewer aha moments when I read about Sarnor. So it was more of a reverse. I started looking things up in the reverse order rather than knowing where to start and finding things to look for. I had to look at what George did and try to undo it and backdate it to where the influence was coming from. There's a lot of good that comes from this. Of course, when you're looking into stuff like that, you broaden your own horizons. You look up history. So some of those discoveries were ancient Babylon, ancient India a little bit. The biggest influence seems to be ancient Iran. The Sumerians, the Scythians, the Sarmatians especially, the Medes, and the most famous of all, Persia. The Persian Empire, both in its early days and when it became big and wealthy, both apply here. And that's the pattern of these people. From nomadic horse tribes to vast, wealthy cities. That's kind of how Persia went, too. So, you ready to go, Sean?
Yeah.
Cool. Let's do it. Let's have our first quote of the day, introducing us to Sarnor.
In the southeast, the proud city-states of the Kothi arose. In the forest to the north, along the shores of the shivering sea, were the domains of the Woodswalkers, a diminutive folk whom many maesters believed to have been kin to children of the forest. Between them could be found the hill kingdoms of the Cimmeri, the long-legged Gips with their wicker shields and lime-stiffened hair, and the brown-skinned, pale-haired Zokora, who rode to war in chariots. Most of these peoples are gone now, their cities burned and buried, their gods and heroes all but forgotten. Of the Kothi cities, only Karth remains, dreaming of past glories beside the jealously guarded jade gates which link the summer and jade seas. The others were extinguished, driven into exile, or conquered and assimilated by the people who succeeded them. Westeros remembers their conquerors as the Sarnori, for at its height, their great kingdom included all the lands watered by the Sarn and its vassals, and the three great lakes that were all that remained of the shrinking Silver Sea.
So we actually see this very early on, not by name. Kind of like maybe Bloodraven or the Blackfire Rebellions. George had the idea, but hadn't fully fleshed it out, maybe didn't give it a name, and it probably wouldn't have been appropriate to give it a name even if he had it. He might have chosen to throw it in there, but Dany's, a young girl, and Sarnor, as we'll find out, is largely forgotten. It is even well known by maesters in the Citadel, partly because it's so far away, it's remote, a lot of the records were destroyed, most of the records were destroyed. So it also wouldn't necessarily have been realistic for Dany or anyone with her, even Jorah, who was a little more knowledgeable, to know what the heck this was. The cities of the Rhoyne are more famous. They're on the river. They're more remembered. It was more recent that they were destroyed. So that also makes sense that those were remembered.
An example of that, Aziz?
Sure.
The Tigris and Euphrates in ancient times were so incredibly important to the world civilization at that moment. But now, way more people know about the Mississippi or the Amazon. Does that make sense?
Good point.
Even though those at that time, it's the shifting of cultures and time change how well things are known. So
good point. Yeah, and so Dany and Tyrion both pass this. Not just Dany, but Tyrion sails downriver, so he doesn't actually get to see this. But Dany, when continuing on east with Drogo's Khalasar, this takes them through a lot of what was once the Kingdom of Sarnor. They see ruined cities a couple times, and again, just there's no name attached to them. But we, in this episode are going to give you some examples. We think we've identified what some of these ruins are specifically, and if not, we'll be able to narrow it down to a few guesses because we have good information on where these things were. We have a pretty clear view of where Dany marched. And that means Jorah and her handmaidens and blood raiders have all seen this too, and have before, because they came this way the first time. Jorah, I think, had been to Vaes Dothrak already, and her handmaidens and blood riders certainly had. So they've passed this way both times. So they've seen these ruins at least twice, maybe multiple times, some of them probably several times. In that long, excellent quote that Sean read us is the Silver Sea. And the Silver Sea was a large body of water that, as it says, shrank until it became just a few lakes and a big river called the Sarn. Let's start with the Silver Sea. It's kind of the cradle of civilization in Essos, and it makes it pretty interesting and a good place to start. Like many, if not most, ancient civilizations, both real and imagined, the people we're diving deep on today started around a river, but it was once a sea. Quote,
Beyond the forest of Qohor, Essos opens up onto... Essos opens up upon a vast expanse of windswept plains, gentle rolling hills, fertile river valleys, great blue lakes, and endless steeps where the grass grows as high as a horse's head. From the forest of Qohor in the west to the towering mountains known as the Bones, the grasslands stretch more than 700 leagues. It was here, amidst these grasses, that civilization was born in the Dawn Age. 10,000 years ago, or more, when Westeros was yet a howling wilderness, inhabited only by the giants and children of the forest, the first true towns arose beside the banks of the river Sarn and beside the myriad vassal streams that fed her on her meandering course northward to the Shivering Sea.
Nice. Yeah, that's so cool. And it basically gives the same vibe of the Dawn Age in Westeros. Like, this is the earliest times.
Cradle of civilization right
Boom,
here.
Yeah. Just like Sean mentioned the Tigris and Euphrates. That was a great point. It's the equivalent, I think, here. I mean, this is the first of the first men. So it wasn't, like it says, it wasn't always a river, but by the time humans came along, it was. Maybe when children and giants were roaming the land without humans, it was still the Silver Sea, which is
giants, it was a stream.
Well, you wonder where it got its name, you know? But this is the region in which the kingdom of Sarnor emerged. All the dried up Silver Sea became the kingdom of Sarnor. You know, there's a lot of time passed between that. And now, of course, it's mostly the Dothraki Sea, which, as we know, is a sea of grass, not water. But again, it kind of helps the metaphor a bit, the fact that it is called the Dothraki Sea and used to actually literally be one. And that's realistic, as we'll get into a little bit later in the episode. That is how a lot of Great Plains came to be in the first place. Another aspect of the Sarmatian people, I said they were probably the best match that fits super well here, is that they seem to have started as a matriarchal society before changing over time, eventually into more commonly recognized male monarchies. Here, the earliest portions of the story of the Sarnori people include a group of legendary figures called the Fisher Queens, right? So there you go, ancient matriarchal society. And let's have Nina's take here. She says, it reminds her of the kings of House Fisher in Westeros, just as the first inhabitants of this proto-Sarnori kingdom were among the oldest peoples of recorded civilization, and the Fisher Queens, the first rulers of these first people, so the Fisher Kings were one of the oldest, if not, in fact, the oldest of the first men, royal dynasties in the Riverlands. The Fisher Queens ruled from a floating palace in the midst of the Silver Sea, the large inland sea in central Essos, of course, while the Fisher Kings ruled from the Misty Isle, perhaps in the God's Eye, the large lake at the heart of the Westerosi continent. So there's a really strong parallel here, even if some of the details are, say, lost to the mists of time or just should be properly categorized as mythical, if not, or legendary, if not mythical. She continues here, just as the first of the Sarnori High Kings was supposedly the son of the last of the Fisher Queens, so today the legacy of House Fisher seems to survive with House Shawnee, which includes a catfish on its arms, just as the Fishers had. Below a divided field of blue, red, and green, right? Like a which matches the colors of the trident. So that's pretty straightforward. The House Strong and House Tully, other houses make color designations like that. Tullys don't have green, but still. And those are the first royals of the kingdoms and rivers and hills. So it's a really strong parallel, really well sussed out there by Nina. I didn't notice some of the Fisher King connections there, but it's also a play on the literary concept of a Fisher King, which is a mythological figure, also connected to Bran's potential future, which is a topic for another time. But I think George is playing with the notion of that here. So pretty cool, pretty distant, pretty dreamy, I guess you could say. But Sean, here's where it gets more logistical too. Something to sink your teeth into, perhaps. Fishing is just pretty straightforward as one of the humanity's first methods of sustenance. I mean, fishing is easier. I mean, fishing really is a form of hunting. We don't call it that. Or maybe it's more appropriately trapping, but trapping is a form of hunting. It just isn't. It's just generally called different, but you're basically just trying to catch an animal. It's just this animal's in the water. And if you're on shore, it's pretty safe. You're not risking much. Boats, okay, there's a little more risk there. But as far as hunting an animal, a fish, when you're standing on the shore, it's about as safe as it gets.
It definitely maybe roots you more. Before there was agriculture, which would definitively root you to a set spot.
Oh, good point. Yeah.
It's still, fishing is still relatively more set than just, nomadically traveling around. Maybe there was still some amount of traveling. Maybe, the flow of fish might change based on the weather. And as populations around a fishing source grow, you might start to outfish it.
Yeah, true.
You might need to move or spread out or do something different. But you can see how a community who has discovered the ability to fish in a good spot for it is going to grow way bigger than another community that hasn't.
Yeah, true that, especially if they supplement, if it's just a supplement, like you said, like if they live around this huge river, or they could just travel up and down, hunting and doing other gathering, and there's always the river or lake, if we're going really far back, nearby to fish in. Now,
not to mention the steady stream of fresh water.
Oh, yeah.
And, probably fertile land around. It could be a lot of territory around the river, but
yeah, I would think so.
The potential for travel as well,
Oh, good point, yeah. And just knowing where you're at, having like a place to not necessarily call home. Eventually they may have, but at first it's just like a very recognizable terrain feature to orient yourself and all that. So the magical overtones, and grandeur of these early legends is not unlike the Age of Heroes in Westeros. Though, of course, keep in mind, this predates humans even living in Westeros. If this is something of an Age of Heroes of Essos, it happened well before the one in Westeros. But interestingly, other magical aspects may have a related, if not entirely common origin. We've spoken a few times, though never with a focus on the Ifakevron, which are the woods walkers, the forest people that were mentioned in one of the opening quotes just now. Let's run through some simple logic here and see if you all agree. So starting off, given that they, in description at least, resemble the children of the forest, they may be of the same species, perhaps a branch, maybe the exact same species with just a different name. Maybe there's just superficial differences, like they have darker or lighter skin, minor variations in like hair color, hair texture, things like that. Basically the same minor variations and patterns that occur within real human races, right? This could be just something like that, where they look pretty similar, but there's distinct differences. The Dothraki are the main source for this description of this species or people. We're not sure what they are exactly. And the Dothraki are far, far younger race than the Sarnori. And Ifakevron is a Dothraki word. So if the Dothraki know of the Ifakevron, then it's pretty hard to imagine that the Sarnori don't. They were around way longer, closer to the ancient times when the Ifakevron would have actually been around. And so, it's really hard to fathom that they didn't know these people
unless the Dothraki made them up.
I hadn't thought of that one. Good one. I had not considered that. They made them up. It's like, yeah, they were forest people here. They were really tough. They were real tough badasses, but we took them out.
Americans know about elves, but the Greeks didn't even know about elves.
The Greeks don't even know about elves?
They're more ancient than us, yeah.
Whoa, don't they know about elves? So, the Sarnori are known to have wielded sorcery, too, at least on a small scale. We don't get a lot of detail. Perhaps a greater amount than we're aware of, but it wasn't enough that could stop them from the Dothraki. It wasn't like they weren't able to launch lightning bolts at opposing armies or anything. We haven't seen anything like that in any of Westeros history in any place, though, so that's not a surprise, is it? But it would be a really compelling and I'd say satisfying connection to find out that or at least to have some confirmation, or at least to keep the idea supported, that the first men eventually learned the magic of the children, and the first men in Essos, the ones whom the Westerosi first men descend from, they also encountered and learned the magic of the cousins of the Ifequevron, which would be the children of the forest. So maybe a similar pattern of humanity learning magic from the different species of children of the forest, of which the Ifequevron were one. That would be similar to a lot of fantasy traditions where, again, to mention elves taught humans magic in a lot of different traditions. Like, I think Lord of the Rings started that, and well, maybe it wasn't maybe it wasn't elves that taught humans magic. But anyway, it's in The Witcher and other spots too. I don't know my Lord of the Rings.
The Dragon Prince.
Well. Okay,
is kind of a newer, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So there's definitely other ones out there. It's a fairly common one. Humans getting taught magic from some elder race. That's not a new thing by any means. So yeah, what if the children aren't just cousins, but descendants of Ifequevron? The children are like a younger version. Ifequevron are the truly older ones. Maybe they all emerged from the Silver Sea, right? Long before they took to the forests. Hey, we all come from the water, right? Maybe they do too. They're children of the forest, but maybe they didn't start there. Children of the water that became children of the forest. Adults of the forest, children of the water. Yeah. No. And speaking of water magic, right? The Rhoynar, it's hard not to think of the Rhoynar, a great people destroyed that lived along a river, that reached really high heights of civilization. So I think the Rhoynar were nicer people, but still, there's some parallels here. So it could be water magic, right? Similar concept that we've tossed around in so many places, Sean, right? The idea of magical energy is there to be tapped into. You may call it different things. You may manage it differently, but it's like an elemental thing. Water magic, fire magic, like it seems pretty well supported. I mean, it's not proven, but it's a working idea, don't you think?
Yeah, that's my sort of, I don't know, interpretation or whatever, is that there's different ways for some core magical element to manifest itself, whether it's in a religious way, or the interpretations of the religions of the world, or or the physical location or culture that is tapping into it, or learning or believing in it in one way or the other. But in my opinion is that it's all, I can easily see that maybe in George's mind or some author's mind that maybe there's two different magic sources and different groups tap into them in different ways. But even if there's only two or two instead of one, it still manifests itself in a bunch of different ways from there, usually related to, as you usually point out, like the nearby elements, snow or volcanoes or rivers or whatever,
It seems to be right. It makes sense that would be the thing that they eventually, got involved with. If any form of magic was around for them to be involved with, it would be that element that they're closest to. Now, as well.
And I just was going to say, Avatar and the Airbender series. There's four main elements: earth, air, fire, water, right? But like in the desert, the earthbenders are sandbenders.
Oh, yeah.
There's swamp benders, are kind of a mix of water and earth, but everything basically revolves around those four. But there's different variations of them. There's bloodbenders, or like the dark water benders, and so on.
In the Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, they're all allomancers, which is they ingest small amounts of metal and burn that metal.
I think you said like aloe vera.
Oh. Aloe vera. Yeah. Well, they use that afterwards because it makes their skin really rough, so they do need the aloe vera afterwards. But no, they you ingest certain metals, and if you have the ability to, you can channel it into magic. And the type of metal determines the type of magic. And there's some people that can only do one, and then there's like the really fancy people that can do multiples, and it's pretty neat. So yeah, this is definitely an idea that's out there that gets used by fantasy authors in different ways, and it's pretty cool. Like you get versions like this, it's extremely vague and not known. Or take Brandon Sanderson, where there's like charts that tell you, tells you exactly, okay, platinum does this, this one does this. If these two are combined, it does this. It's extremely well known because there's like schools and stuff that people have figured it out. Yeah. So, and that makes sense in that setting. So, yeah, and again, this relates to the Rhoynar. Again, Rhoynar water magic, water wizards, or what they had. These even could be directly related in terms of descendants. If this was the cradle of civilization and some early humans learned water magic and then those people migrated elsewhere, Well, the Rhoyne is really close by, and if they're like, hey, we already know water magic, let's stay here. This is an even bigger river. Like it's really easy to imagine something like that. People are migrating, looking for new homes in the early days. As we've talked about before, they're probably not going to go really far. If they find something nice nearby, why would they keep going? Let's live here.
A lot of times, also, rivers are an obstacle. Like, it's
true.
really hard to get. Like, nowadays, we take it for granted how valuable bridges are.
Yeah.
We just drive across in like 30 seconds, but it might have taken like a month to get your family across a river to find a point to cross to carry all your stuff. And it's and once you do, a lot of times that's where a lot of settlements come from, is a day's travel from the water or something like that.
Yeah, true that. And that point hits even harder here, Sean, because we're talking about the Rhoyne, the biggest river, right? I mean, and the Sarn, which is our subject river, is pretty darn huge too. Right, really, really big. So there's something kind of fitting, especially in a fantasy setting, for, given in the real world, there's a lot of times holy reverence given to places where, that are life-giving, whether you worship the river that your society depends on, or something worshiping like where people think they came from, or having a reverence for it. It's a similar thing here, but there's an actual magic attached to it. The magic of the first humans, right? That water magic carried forward into the world by other people that knew how to wield it. There's something really cool about that. I like that. It's so distant but grand.
Yeah, I tend to feel pretty strongly that the Rhoyne are. I mean, really, it seems like all of civilization is descended from the Sarnori and the Fisher Queens to a certain extent, but I do think that there's a direct connection between the Sarnori and the Rhoynar. Personally, I think there's great evidence in the naming conventions that we see between these Sarnori cities and the Rhoynar city-states. See, we have the Rhoynar city-states of Sarhoy, Nai Sar, and Sarmel.
Yeah,
right?
with Sarnath and the Sarn.
It seemed really obvious to me personally,
yeah.
that there's a connection there.
That SAR is all over the place. You're right.
People of the Rhoyne are called Rhoynar.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, 100%.
Sarnor, Rhoynar, it's not that different, right?
But yeah, you got places like Arnor, that just the names just all sound so similar.
Yeah,
for sure.
It's really true. And as well, if the Silver Sea was there, like if it hadn't fully faded before humanity started to live around it, then Sean was asking right before we started if the Rhoyne and the Sarn connect. They may have one time long ago. They don't currently. But go back far enough, I bet they did. And they may have just all been the Silver Sea, which maybe that sounds really huge, but as you'll see in our next subtopic here, IRL inland seas, there's nothing unrealistic about that. Let's talk about a good model for the possible inspiration for the Silver Sea. I'm going to do like a episode of Crime Stoppers, The inspiration for the Silver Sea is the Western Interior Sea, a.k.a. the Western Interior Seaway, a.k.a. the Cretaceous Seaway, a.k.a. the Niobrarian Sea, a.k.a. the North American Inland Sea. Be on the lookout for it. Call Crime Stoppers. Now, so this was 33 to 140 million years ago, and it bisected North America in two. So yeah, huge freaking sea here. It turned two land masses were the Laramidia and the Appalachia. And the Laramidia is basically where the Rockies formed, and Appalachia, well, that's self-explanatory. It's the Appalachians. It connected the Gulf of Mexico to the Arctic Ocean, y'all. Like, whoa. But at its deepest, it was only about 3,000 feet deep, 900 meters. That's not deep at all for something, that stretches across a whole damn continent, right? So that's just like kind of hard to imagine. I almost said hard to fathom, but I think I used that joke before on like the same lake joke or something. But it gradually dried out, formed smaller bodies of water. We're still talking about the Western Interior Sea, rather. And it created places with really cool names like the Sundance Sea, another evocative name, but long gone. And then some of these smaller bodies of water themselves vanish. Like we're talking, again, over 33 to 100 million years ago. So we've got a lot of time for bodies of water to form and go away. And it left a very abundant sea life. There's some really incredible fossils that have been found. The largest freshwater eel thing has been discovered there. And it would be similar to the Silver Sea, explains a lot regarding its place as a cradle of civilization in Martin's world, right? It receded, the Western Inland Sea, formed places like the prairies of Canada and the Great Plains in central U.S. they became vast grasslands. Like I said at the beginning, like the Dothraki Sea is now, the Silver Sea turned into the Dothraki Sea. Same thing happened in the U.S. and Canada and places around the world. Now, the difference, of course, in North America is they didn't have horses back then. Well, they did exist in Eurasia, and they did have horses in Essos long back. So let's take a quick look at Eurasia. Vast IRL inland seas existed there as well, like the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, the Aral Sea, Lake Urmia, and Narnak Lake were one lake once. Well, not a lake, it was the Paratethys Sea, which stretched from north of the Alps all the way to Central Asia and Central Africa. That's kind of hard to... I keep wanting to say fathom.
You know?
Can't help myself.
It's not just my Asia, Aziz. It's all of our Asias.
Yeah. No, it's my Asia. It's not your Asia. But let's not leave out Africa, because they've got some awesome additions to this topic as well. East Africa has the African Great Lakes, the largest of which are Victoria, Tanganyika, and Malawi, which we've talked about briefly before. They used to be one lake, they became 3 lakes, then they became 1 lake, then they became 3 lakes again. And that's where a lot of the world's African cichlids come from. I have 2 African cichlid tanks down in our basement. They're great fish. And those lakes comprise 25% of the world's unfrozen freshwater, those African lakes. And most of them are rift lakes, if you recall. We talked about rift lakes. That's when the tectonic plates separate and the water just rushes in to fill that gap created by it. So, pretty cool. Anything to add to the inland sea stuff, Sean, or is that just a good setup?
Yeah, good setup. A lot of those things you're talking about were things that happened before humans existed, much less history of humans.
Yeah.
But I wonder in Martin's world, if any of these, are there people that knew or were alive at the time that the Silver Sea existed?
I do wonder that too.
As a waterway, anyway.
I feel like the children did, and the giants perhaps as well. Probably did, because the children, all accounts seem to be that the giants and children are of a similar age in the world. And so I would imagine they were there. But maybe not people.
But even still, you don't necessarily... You still think that's more because those shiftings of the geography happened, tens of thousands of years ago, not because the children and giants are 1 million or more years old, right?
Yeah, well, maybe both. I mean, it is possible. Like, the children could be 1 million years old. That wouldn't be that strange, like using real-world history. I mean, they were Neanderthals 1 million years ago. It's not that strange. So I could believe that. I don't know. It's not one thing we can sit down and say with confidence. But it would make a lot of sense. I think I would lean that way. If someone's like, guess how old the children have been around, I would say more than 1 million years.
If someone said, guess how long ago the Silver Sea existed, what would you say?
Oof. Given this stuff about from the real world, how long ago these things faded, it might have to be millions of years gone. But maybe not. Maybe it dried up more recently. It's certainly possible. I mean, again, like we have to keep repeating ourselves when we say our own history, taken as a whole, is a sample size of 1.
Yeah.
Like, we do have many different inland seas on Earth, and we can see the patterns within, but that's on Earth, right?
Yeah.
This is not Earth. It might, like, a slight variation in gravity or in the seasons or the atmosphere having different minerals. Like, it probably isn't super different, or because there are humans. But still.
Even the moon, I've brought this up before, but like our world wouldn't be like it is if it wasn't for the moon. It's at just the right distance and orbit that it churns the mantle, the molten core of the Earth, which gives us a magnetic field, which deflects solar rays, which otherwise would kill. It would destroy DNA molecules. You know what I mean?
It wouldn't have formed in the first place. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. You're right. It really is quite amazing. All the
it stabilizes the axis and the orbit, which gives us seasons and et cetera, et cetera.
Regarding the length of the Silver Sea's existence, Nina points out there does seem to be a cultural memory of the Silver Sea as a single unit, what with the Fisher Queens. So it's possible it's relatively more recent than real life seas that have disappeared. That's
a really good argument, because the reason we know about the Western Inland Sea and the Paratethys Ocean is archaeology and paleontology, which, as we've said many times, isn't available here. There's no Silver Sea archaeologist that we know of. I mean, maybe there was during the peak of Sarnor. Maybe that's something they cared about. They wanted to understand their history. And maybe that's where some of that info comes from. But Nina's right in suggesting that it's probably more recent because of that factor. The memory of it. Like, yeah, I don't think Neanderthals probably had memory of the Paratethys Ocean, whatever their word was for it was. Because I don't think Neanderthals existed back then. 33 million years ago? No, that's too far.
I don't think so. Yeah.
So, now, the real world, as subject as it is to things that we aren't aware of. Like, science has uncovered a lot about the way the world works, about how our history works, meaning, like, natural history, not even human history. That, too, of course, but I'm talking natural history only. At the moment, there's so many things we haven't yet discovered, but there's one thing that we can be pretty sure will never happen in the real world, which is that an author will make a mistake and that will erase a natural feature in the world. So that brings us to our section called The River Overwritten. Yes, bodies of water and other natural features are subject to a type of cataclysm not found in the real world. Indeed. So when George first wrote Kingdom of Sarnor on the map he gave to the author who drew the maps, whose name I forgot to write down here. It must be here somewhere. Anyway, George wrote Kingdom of Sarnor on, handed over to the guy who drew the Lands of Ice and Fire. But what happened was he accidentally covered up the Sarn when he wrote Kingdom of Sarnor, and the Lands of Ice and Fire came out wrong. And the World of Ice and Fire app came out wrong. So they're both wrong. Michael's map behind us? Wrong. Sorry. It's also wrong. It's right everywhere else as far as I know, just the Sarnor area. And it's not that wrong. It's just the river's a little off. And some of the ruins are in the wrong places. This is true for all of them. So again, main edition books, all wrong. The only place you can find the right one is the TV show. How random is that? The TV show has the correct Sarnor map. Why would you might be asking? Both, why do we know for sure it's the right one, and why does the TV show have the only one? Well, because George submitted the same thing to the TV show without the thing written over the river, so it came out right. and the Lands of Ice and Fire guy didn't have to like figure out what was intended. Also, when the World of Ice and Fire is describing the procession of Sarnori cities, the order and the description of where they're placed fits the TV show map, which we don't have to call the TV show map. It's not the TV show map. It is given by the TV show, but it's George's map that he submitted to both. That one came out correctly. Didn't get through the process without mistakes. So that's where you can find the real map. Did you put it up on screen?
I am now. I'm just
okay, cool.
Talking about what it was, but no, I need warning.
Cool. So yeah, I neglected to check on that, so now Shay's got it up there. And
talk about what's on the screen and the Michael map, yeah.
Yeah, so what we're seeing is basically the correct one you can see doesn't have Michael's style. That's kind of one way you can tell. And the difference is that the river goes straight south from the mouth of the Shivering Sea and then cuts east, basically with all the rivers following it until it ends at a collection of 3 lakes. And you'll see various other versions that have it going south or the river cuts north sooner, or just a variety of different versions that aren't quite right. So it's not important to go through the ones that are wrong. Rather, it just kind of seems like we can save a little time and tell you which one is the correct one, and to always look for that one if you are looking.
Worth noting, by the way, similar to the pronunciation of names in the real world, in the world that is real to the characters that we're reading about, those maps are probably not all accurate either. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Like some maester in the Citadel or someone in King's Landing probably has a map of Essos and it's probably not right. They probably don't have the rivers and the dimensions correct and some city names are wrong or whatever else. So.
Absolutely. One of the earliest historians in the world is Herodotus. And it's interesting because Herodotus had a reputation for a long time of just people thought he was making stuff up. Like some of his stuff was accurate, some of it was wrong. Some people think he was a little bit a bumbler. But history has brought him back around as actually, no, a lot of this was more accurate than we thought. Some of the crazy things that he put in there actually turned out to be accurate. They just were kind of didn't sound like they could be true, or they were just what people believed at the time. It was accurate as to what people thought, even if it wasn't truly real. And so Sean brings up a great point. Like there were some maps where he drew. He talked about places that didn't exist. Herodotus says that's one example of, yeah, that wasn't real. But people believed these things were real, and so he recorded them. And that's true. Like you have maps that are inaccurate. Like at today's time, yeah, it's another thing. You take bridges, use that as an example. We take maps for granted. They're they're all accurate. We just have like these extremely. I mean, they're not perfectly accurate.
Yeah, although I will say, that is one of the things that I remember blew my mind the most when I grew up and left high school was how wrong our maps are.
Yeah, they're wrong on like the global scale.
On a global scale,
yeah,
very wrong. I mean, if you're not familiar, I'll just say, and probably most of you are, but just the sizes of the countries are misrepresented on maps.
That's true.
Make certain countries look much larger, which has ramifications, and we won't go into that right here, but definitely if you haven't seen like size accurate maps, Google that.
Yeah, it's one of the nice things about a globe as a map is that you can get a lot more accurate visualization of what the places look like. So Shea's right, because they're even with modern maps, which are so-called accurate, they're not. But they are vastly more accurate than ancient maps would be. They have, on a global scale, they can be wrong, but still, like when you're taking directions from New York to Florida, there's 1,000 different accurate maps you can use that won't mislead you even slightly.
I was muted right there, so I guess you kind of repeated what I said. Sean, tell me if I'm muted, please. I find out in the chat too late, and I was like, you need to tell me when I start talking, but I guess as he's repeated it, I guess you got what I said, Sean, enough that you didn't say anything.
I could hear you, and I wasn't sure if other people could, and I didn't know how long you're going to go on, so I didn't want to interrupt.
Always interrupt me. Always interrupt me if I'm muted.
So what she said was that there's lots of inaccurate maps. Like the world maps are often inaccurate because of showing two countries too large, sometimes too small, and that has a variety of effects on how people view the world. But other than that, world maps of today tend to be pretty accurate. So yes,
they're more accurate than they used to be because we have satellite imagery and stuff, and things are more standardized and homogenized. But it is sometimes still askew just because of the nature of the warping of the world when you try to make it flat. But also, I think the point Shea was making is that sometimes for propaganda, I guess.
Yeah.
Yes.
A country wants to make itself seem larger. It was a little bit of humor in The King and I, the map of Siam that was being taught to the kids, like Siam was like the size of Asia.
It's also just like where things are placed, like relative to other, like where the center of a map is, right? We always have like North America is often so centered with Europe, like the Atlantic Ocean is centered, whereas like, well, why? We're not the center of the world. We live in our part of the world. Anyway, let's get back to this. So think about how far Sarnor is from Westeros. It's really far. If you look over my right shoulder here, you can see it. It's all over here, and Westeros is way the hell over there. But that's where Dany is. I mean, this isn't, it is really far away, but that's where she is. That's where she starts. And in fact, that's where she is now if she's on her way in the Dothraki Sea. So
it's also where Tyrion is,
yeah,
and Victarion, and several Jorah, many characters.
Yeah, they're farther south, but they're still that far away, right? It's this general area that far. So this part of the continent is a big part of the story, even if not that many characters go there. Very important characters go there. It doesn't include that. So it makes sense that the information would be less accurate the farther east she goes. Like she goes even farther east than that. She goes to Vaes Dothrak, which is I think the farthest east anyone goes on page, but we'll see about that. Obviously, Melisandre and people have been to, Ashai, but that's not on page. That's in their memories. So yeah, the actual map, if we're going to kind of frame things and do like a centering of things. I know Shea had the map up already. I'm not sure she still has it up, but it'd be nice to put it back up. Northwest of the Kingdom of Sarnor, which was large, so we're kind of sort of basing it on the center, which would be Sarnath. That was the so-called capital. It wasn't really the capital, but it was where the High King ruled from, which you could kind of call it a capital, but it wasn't. They were independent. We'll get into that part later. So northwest is the Shivering Sea. Northeast is Omber and Ib. Ib, of course, is an island, but they have some land-based territories. East and southeast is the Dothraki Sea. Of course, it wasn't called that back then, but that is what it is. We can recognize it that way. Straight south would be Slavers Bay and Valyria. Southwest would be Valyria and Volantis and the southern portion of the Rhoyne. Straight west is the Forest of Qohor, northern Rhoyne, and the Axe. Now, of course, the Kingdom of Ifakevron would also be to sort of northeast, basically, but farther along. Now, as far as actual people, one of the things that Shea said here is connecting to the Rhoynar that makes a lot of sense is just what they look like. They have a similar skin and eye color, close enough anyway to guess that they may have been related. They call themselves the Tagaez Fen. I don't know how to say that. Tagaez, I'm not sure. Tagaez. Another nice AE name in there. Tagaez Fen.
Yeah, Tagaez Fen. Yeah.
So here's a quote giving a general description of their appearance and origins. Quote.
Long of limb and brown of skin they were, like the Zikora, though their hair and eyes were black as night. Warriors, sorcerers, and scholars, they traced their descent to the hero king they called Azor Ahai, the Amazing, born of the last of the Fisher Queens, who took to wife the daughters of the greatest lords and kings of the Gyps, the Samurai, the Samurai and the Zikora, binding all three people to his rule. His Zikora wife drove his chariot, it is said. Simur wife made his armor, for her people were the first to work on iron, and he wore about his shoulders a great cloak made from the pelt of a king of the hairy men.
Whoa. Yeah, that hairy men bit, that's a little creepy, because the hairy men, we're not entirely sure what they are. We talk about them in our When Giants Roamed episode with Amanda Crowfoot's daughter. It's not clear whether they were a race of giants or something in between the giants and the Ibonese, because the Ibonese are very hairy and the giants are very hairy. But if they were like remotely humanoid, then this guy's basically going Bolton here, like wearing the skin of an enemy. I was like, whoa, that's pretty hardcore.
This whole thing here is very, I used the term conveniently symbolic. Like I imagine this is just a myth of the uniting of these lands and these peoples or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, it makes sense to have a king marry the three daughters from three different groups of people, and their bloodline gets to trace its roots to the working of iron and the so on and so on.
It's Garth Greenhand, all the different daughters, and so, yeah, it's similar kind of thing. Instead of marrying them while he just had them kids with different women, and yeah, it's a really similar ideal. Being the first, being born of the Fisher Queens, it's the same kind of like what did Nina coin it, mythological propaganda. Yeah, very similar. There's going to be more examples of it coming shortly here. Let's talk about the implication that they're the tall men, which is an interesting concept. In the real world, in the ancient world, the tallest people were the Gravettian peoples. They were mammoth hunters, and they lived from 33,000 to 22,000 BC. They averaged 6 feet tall. So this shatters your image of ancient peoples being shorter. Most of them were shorter, but there are obviously variations. I mean, we're talking, again, 22,000 BC, these people died out. They were around 11,000. I mean, they didn't die out. They just scattered and became new peoples, basically. Average 6 feet, not low end, not tall end. That's average. Pretty wild. Native Americans of the plains, the ones who rode horses, were the tallest in the world in the 1800s. They were taller than Europeans of that era. People think of Native Americans as being maybe a little shorter in stature. But that's because of reservations, because of the disease and lack of nutrition, and basically being in what, especially in the early days, were basically like outdoor concentration camps.
And propaganda too, I'm sure.
Yep, more of that. You're right. Absolutely. But
like when we make a movie of the Old West, the main white guy hero isn't a 4'11" with talking to the 6'6" Native American. It's the other way around.
Right. They pick a small guy as the villain, small Indian villain, big, tall, handsome white guy. Yeah, that's right. Nowadays, in the modern world, the tallest people are the Dutch, the Croatians, the Bosnia-Herzegovinans, and the Montenegrins, which are they all have Gravettian DNA. So it all comes back to that.
Interesting. I would have thought there might have been some like Polynesian or Samoan, like something like that. But perhaps they have too many short people throwing it all off.
Yeah, I guess maybe, yeah, because
they might have bigger extremes.
Right, the ranges might be larger. I didn't look at that. I didn't look at ranges, but yeah, this is average height.
Yeah, average.
Yeah, which you're right. Yeah, like the Samoans might be some of the like just
biggest and smallest, like mixed together, because they have some very small folks too in those cultures. Yeah, for sure. Like they can be some small ones, but yeah, that's interesting.
It's a pretty small culture, but I'm pretty sure, I don't know if your research was that thorough, Aziz. I'm pretty sure the tallest average culture is the NBA.
It is a culture. So yeah.
Whoa, you got me there. And you're right. Like, what could possibly be taller? What grouping of people? Wow. Yes, indeed. Now, what a fine race that is. Very athletic, So those three races were mentioned there: the Zikora, the Gips or the Gyps, I don't know how to say it, and the Samurai. Let's talk about them briefly. The Zikora, it just says they're brown-skinned and pale-haired. That's kind of cool sounding. That's vaguely, like, is that Drow, kind of? Isn't that what the Drow look like in D&D? Like, brown-skinned and pale hair, which George said he didn't want to. He almost did that for the Valyrians and then changed his mind because they were Drow.
Wrong, but I think the Drow are more like dark gray, like charcoal.
Oh, okay.
Than brown. That's my vision anyway.
I think you might be right, actually, now that you mention it. Anyway, the Zikora are the ones we know the least about, but they apparently look the most like the Sarnori. Like, that's the Sarnori look. They have that more traditional look, apparently, whereas the Samurai and Gip look was more, I guess, less common, I suppose. But these are the three major ethnic groups. So the Gips were, from the World of Ice and Fire, it says they were long-legged and wore lime-stiffened hair, and in war they carried wicker shields. That was a feature of many Eastern armies. Remember, at the beginning I said Iran was a major influence in the peoples of Iran. And many of the peoples I suggested were Iranian people. Sarmatian, Scythian, Persian, those are all Iranian. The many Eastern armies of like, say, Alexander's time, ancient Greece, they, in that relative same area, 500, 600 BC, carried wicker shields into battle, including the very famous Persian immortals, inaccurately portrayed in the movie 300, but they did exist. We don't know, modern people don't know how effective wicker shields are, but they must have been pretty good, or they wouldn't have just keep using them. The one theory is that they were a technique that developed on the grasslands, like a thing between horse riders. Like, it was good. They were good at catching missile weapons. Maybe not great at stopping a sword, but they didn't have swords then. This is ancient. We're talking pre-swords. We're talking spears, javelins, sharpened sticks, pointed sticks, clubs. Yeah. So, like, a club maybe isn't that effective against a wicker shield, or a wicker shield rather isn't that effective against a club, perhaps. But
it's still more effective than no shield, I think.
Yeah, that's true. And we got to keep in mind,
it's not like it just shatters on impact. It would block a solid
right. It
blow,
wouldn't shatter. It would give a little. That might even help. Like, keep that in mind too, y'all. That you're comparing it to a wooden shield. A lot of ancient wooden shields would be pretty brittle as well. So
like fragile.
Yes,
yeah,
I think you're right.
Brittle.
Fragile and brittle together like that. So. Yeah, so we a lot of those weren't as strong as we might have thought either. A lot of them were really thin.
You know what
just
they
kind
make
of
me
nominal.
think of? The lime stiffened hair.
What's that?
It makes me think of of the different Slavers Bay peoples, like the Giscari and
Yeah.
whatnot, because of how they use waxes and oils for their hair to, like, shape it.
Very similar. You're right, because they were doing that to shape it in animal, like horns and things like that, which is exactly the same here, but of course lime instead of oil or or lacquer or what have you. There's a coin has been found depicting the Celtic war leader Vercingetorix, showing his long hair streaming out, stiffened with lime. It was a common enough thing for a lot of Celtic warriors to do. Now, Celtic warrior is it's like saying first men. Celtic is a very broad term. But lime was used by a lot of Celtic tribes to bleach their hair, made it stiff, and they could shape it. A lot of times lion shaping was what they were aiming for.
Oh, it's a mane.
It's a mane, yeah, it's a mane. And so it bleaches it, and it makes it straight and hard. It's also disinfectant. It gets rid of all lice and any sort of creatures that live, of which back then would have, you don't have as many tools. You don't have soap, or you don't have, like, good, modern soap. They had things like lye, which is, I think lime is made from lye, or lye is made from lime, I think. I'm not sure. I don't know. Don't quote me on that one. Anyway, the point is, this seems to be a Celtic thing. There's been other artwork with lime stiffened hair that's been found, descriptions from Roman authors of that. So that seems to be the influence there. So that's maybe not so Iranian there, but still ancient warfare fits in here nicely. The Samurai or Chimeri. Now, this is the one that's got the most.
Wait. Can I just say, someone brought up, like, or they spike it, and I just want to say my visual now of all these people being punk as hell.
Yeah, lime stiffened
like,
with green hair.
Like, yeah, exactly. The green spike mohawks and stuff.
Yeah, this is white lime, not green, like the fruit. So the Samurai were real people. George put a Y in it instead of an I to make it slightly different. But the Sumerian, and he writes it CYMM, IRL it's CIMM. So they were driven out of what became Scythia by the people who are now or were, than the Scythians circa the 8th century BC. They're basically like a Proto-Iranian Thracian ethnic group. They first tried to take Armenia when they were driven out of what became Scythia, but were stopped by the Assyrian king Sargon. There we go, Sargon. And so they moved to Anatolia, which is Turkey, eventually, and settled there for a while until they were, I'll come back to that. This is a reference to Conan as well, because Robert E. Howard, writer of Conan, took the Sumerians and he used a different version of them to make Conan the Barbarian. Conan himself is Sumerian. They're known for smiths in Robert E. Howard's world. Conan's father was a blacksmith. And here we have Essos, the Sumer people are the first in the world to work iron and the ones who made Azor Ahai the Amazing his armor, his famous mythical armor. And the Sumerians were also really tall. So there you go. Lots of connections.
You know, my mind went a different direction. I was thinking of the Sumerians that are basically modern Iraq.
That's right by, yeah.
Same Persian area.
Yeah, you're totally right. Yeah, that's really close by because I mentioned Babylon earlier. Babylon's in Iraq, so that makes a ton of sense. This connection is even more important because in real life it was the Sarmatians who in turn displaced the Scythians. Right? It was the Sumerians displaced by the Scythians, displaced by the Sarmatians, and the Sarmatians weren't displaced, they were destroyed by the Huns. And the Huns, of course, are a major influence on the Dothraki, who eventually destroyed the Sarnori, and they're kind of a combo of Huns and Mongols and other steppe people. Also, like the Sarmatians, the Sarnori women fought alongside the men. Some people, a lot of historical traditions believe it is the Sarmatians who are the source of Amazon legends about the Amazon warrior women that are often told in Greek stories. So that's pretty cool. Got a nice, the old triumvirate of George, real world, and fantasy influence comes together very well there with the Sumerians and the Sarmatians and all that. Let's talk about Azor Ahai more specifically here, the legendary ancestor of all tall men, descended from the Fisher Queens, married a member of all three tribes, as we said. Like Sean said, it binds them together in unity. Nina says it's interesting that the tall men sort of combined all the peoples Azor Ahai married into, brown-skinned and chariot-driving like Sikora, tall like the Gyps, iron-wielding like the Sumera. Yeah, really fits nicely. And polygamy seems to have been a thing then. Right, he marries 3 wives. I mean, there's a lot of ancient societies that did that, but Persia had that. Very notably, Persia had polygamy. It started off as just multiple wives, and eventually when the Persian Empire was at its height, they had just full-blown massive harems. It's really just absurd. Slavery isn't directly mentioned. I wouldn't assume it, but I would guess that it probably exists. They probably did have slavery, but it's not explicitly mentioned, so maybe they didn't. I don't know. What would you guess on that, Sean? What do you think?
Definitely.
You think definitely?
It may not be. We distinguished one time the difference between slaves existing in a culture and a culture's economy being based off slave labor. Right. I think it's probably not an economy based off slave labor, but every freaking culture ever has always had slaves of one sort or another.
Yeah.
I mean, someone could probably find some random exception. I'm like, okay, fine, you found a random exception, but it's the rule,
Yeah, especially like these large kingdoms. It's kind of hard to imagine. It never
conquering kingdoms.
Yeah. What do they do with the people they conquer? Just let them be? Like, you'd like that to be the truth, but it probably isn't. Here's another take from Nina before we move on to the next section. She says, interesting that Yandel describes them as, quote, sorcerers and, quote, scholars in addition to warriors, but doesn't elaborate on either aspect. It's probable that most if not all Sarnori scholarship, to the extent that it was written, and at least some of it was, given the huge library is known to be at Salosh by the Silver Shores, one of the ruined cities. It was destroyed during the fall of the various Sarnori city-states and may have even been partially destroyed before that. If any of Sarnor's works had made their way to the libraries of Valyria pre-Doom, there would have been some of that, but then would have been destroyed by the Doom. So, too bad. Likewise, because the Sarnori were largely wiped out as a people with the exception of the inhabitants of Sath, any oral tradition or cultural memory would have been severely curtailed, if not died out as well. There wouldn't even be, like, refugees to tell these stories, because even most of them were killed. Still, it would be interesting to know what scholarly concepts were most popular among the Sarnori, what concepts they might have first developed that were later discovered or rediscovered elsewhere in the world. And again, we keep coming back to it. because it's so cool and compelling. What kind of magic they practiced? Was it water magic, or was it some sort of other element that they drew on, or is this element model just completely wrong in the first place? I mean,
they had some kind of building magic. We'll get to that later.
Oh yeah, they definitely had some high buildings and some great, there's tall towers. And yeah, we've also got the Lovecraft story, the Doom that came to Sarnath in here as well, which has even taller towers. So we'll get into that in the second half of the episode. Let's talk about the gods of Sarnor. We don't know much about those either. Again, it's one of the things lost to history, but there is physical evidence. We know where a lot of them ended up. Here's a quote from Dany 4, Game of Thrones.
Beyond the Horse Gate, plundered gods and stolen heroes loomed to either side of them. The forgotten deities of dead cities brandished their broken thunderbolts at the sky as Dany rode her silver past their feet. Stone kings looked down on her from their thrones, their faces chipped and stained, even their names lost in the mists of time. Lithe young maidens danced on marble plinths, draped only in flowers, or poured air from shattered jars. Monsters stood in the grass beside the road, black iron dragons with jewels for eyes, roaring griffins, manticores with their barbed tails poised to strike, and other beasts she could not name. Some of the statues were so lovely they took her breath away. Others so misshapen and terrible that Dany could scarcely bear to look at them.
Jorah tells her that those last ones, the misshapen and terrible ones, are from the Shadowlands. But the ones that are so lovely that took her breath away, the lithe young maiden dancing on marble plinths draped only in flowers, stone kings looking down from their thrones. Now, the Dothraki have destroyed a fair amount of peoples, but if we had some stats on that, like Dothraki destruction stats, Dothraki destruction data, the DDD, if we had that, it would likely be that the vast majority, if not most of everything they destroyed, were Sarnori. So if not the majority, certainly more than any other nation. Most of the vase this, vase that the Dothraki have named ruins are Sarnori ruins, which it stands to reason then most of these gods are Sarnori gods that were pulled from there. The black iron dragons with jewels for eyes, probably not Sarnori, but maybe. That probably came from Asaria, that ruined Valyrian outpost that's actually pretty close to the Sarnori kingdom. It's the closest Valyrian city that no longer exists that is connected to Sarnor. It's even connected by the Valyrian roads. That would be a place that could have had some black iron dragons. That would make some sense. The roaring griffins, I'm not sure. The beasts poised in the tall grass, that could be a Sarnori thing. A beast in the tall grass, the grasslands type of thing. What do you think, Sean? What are these? How would you categorize some of these? Which of these stand out to you, or what? Just in general, how does this passage strike you? It's pretty cool, huh?
Yeah, I hadn't thought to think about the clues of what each of them might represent or where they might have come from or the similarities or differences. But I just in general thought it was a good representation of the destruction of the Dothraki.
Yeah.
And a visually awesome, I don't know, example. It's something to imagine, something to blow Dany away or anyone coming upon it. I want to say, like, another thought kind of in the back of my mind. A lot of times when we talk about these sort of historical conquerors and conquering nations, that when I was a kid, I always thought of like these characters, I don't know, Napoleon or Alexander or Caesar. I thought of these great men and all their accomplishments. But nowadays, I think of these terrible men and all their destruction.
Yeah, I know, right?
Viewpoint on it, yeah.
That's similar, yeah. That's totally how I would say it too. Yeah, like when I was growing up reading about history, I was like so fascinated by World War II and just not all aware of just like didn't frame all the destruction and death properly. It was entertainment to me, and I'm like, that's not entertaining. it's awful.
It's important to learn.
Yeah, it is important to learn.
Troubling, yeah.
Yeah, but it isn't like it's just like that's not appropriate. Maybe as a kid it was fine. Like I'm not gonna get myself for that. But kids are kids. But
you should cancel yourself.
I'm canceling 15-year-old Aziz. Yes, it was terrible.
But yeah, this is on some level this is maybe a point of pride of the Dothraki, but to me, it should be a point of shame. You know?
Yeah, right. And it's a religious thing. This thing we'll talk about when we get to the Dothraki. Their whole thing is they put them before the Mother of Mountains. That's their chief deity. And so they're bringing those gods there to bow to their god. There's this very physical representation of how their god is superior to your gods. Like, yours is worshiping ours. It's at our feet, the feet of our god. So it's like, oh, yeah, well, damn. Hardcore. But there's a huge number of possibilities as to what types and variety of Sarnori gods there could be. Later on, there's a quote we'll read that refers to the, quote, 100 gods of Sarnor, which sounds like a lot. And, well, it is a lot. That's a lot of gods. But we're talking about a people that existed over thousands of years and were fairly independent within their own kingdom. Like, it's the kingdom of Sarnor, but as we mentioned, there are all these different city-states that had independence. Maybe they weren't as independent early. Maybe they were various phases of connectivity. Then there's what's the word I'm looking for? Pendulum swings back and forth, and there's periods of great unity and periods of distance, and then back and forth. And we're such a long period of time, lots of things could happen in there. But either way, it would make sense that there'd be varieties amongst the gods and of different times, especially as an empire that it's called a kingdom, but it's basically an empire because it includes all these different peoples, and different peoples would bring their own gods to the table. And, as long as people aren't telling each other who to worship, there's a lot of room for both. Just like in Valyria, right? We saw that with Valyria. The freehold was like, yeah, we rule the crap out of you and tell you what to do. But gods, that part we're pretty loose on. You can go ahead and worship who you want. Which is, again, as we mentioned at the time, a somewhat common feature of empires is to allow religious freedom, whereas a lot of times it's different on a smaller scale when you have a kingdom. But we needn't get back into that. Just needed to restate it to set the stage. Let's move on to our mid-roll here. A couple of questions, shout out or two, and then back to the cities of the Sarn. Want to make sure you all are well aware of the growing bonus episode catalog we have over on Patreon. You can sign up at patreon.com/History of Westeros. The most recent episode is The Buildings of Brandon, a companion to the Brandon the Builder episode, but also works quite nice as a standalone, while the Buildings of the Brandon the Builder episode focuses on the character. The Buildings of Brandon focuses on the structures and how they were made and how that could relate to what happens after A Song of Ice and Fire, or at least the end of A Song of Ice and Fire. We also have episodes on Gogossos, the 10th free city, the city of blood magic, the Red Kraken, and the next episode up in our Patreon catalog will be The Winter's Widow, Joanna Westerling, the woman who stood up to the Red Kraken and led the West against him. Pretty cool, pretty cool. Shout out to Maura Lee, who sends a super chat. Says, Happy Easter to all who celebrate. Happy Sunday to all. Thank you, Aziz, our Queen Ashaya, all the kitties, and to Sean. Love this series. Thank you, Maura. We appreciate it, and we love you too. Thank you for the consistent support. I owe you some cat pictures again. I love sending you cat pictures.
And happy Easter.
Dornish Dame says there's a reference to clan mothers in A Storm of Swords, and Osha says she's of the free folk as her mother and her mother's mother before her, suggesting maybe matriarchal clans among the first men of the free folk still exist, or at least are recent enough to have been remembered. Yeah, great point. Yeah, clan mother. That's a very straightforward title. There's not many other ways to interpret that other than a leadership position. Maybe they're not the top level. A lot of times you have tribes that have sort of ruling bodies, like group isn't just one central authority.
Yeah, and matriarchal societies make sense a lot of times, and especially in these proto ages, just because you can prove someone's your mother a lot more easily than you could prove someone was your father. And you can actually track that.
And there's a reverence to the fact that women are basically magical, that you can make people. People come out of you. It still blows my mind to this day. I can imagine ancient people were still pretty like, wow, people come from, like, you have a reverence for life and things that give life. Well, that's women. That's what they are. They do that. Like, it's right there. You don't have to. There's bodies of water. That's amazing too. But heck, like, yeah, this is shorter scale and much more present and visible. So yeah, let's shout that out, right? Now, Dornish Dame also says this sounds a bit like how the Starks united parts of the North, such as when they married the daughter of the Marsh King into their line. Yeah, the whole triple marriage thing. Yeah, that's really common real world thing. George borrows that, just uniting families, giving them a seat at the table as a way to broker peace between these most powerful warring factions and say, okay, look, we can all benefit from this. Look, we won, but we're going to bring you into the fold and let you have some of this power, even though we've taken a lot of your power away, etc. That kind of thing certainly happened in Sarnor as well. Comment from Palavan says, if the grasslands tribes and later the Sarnori kingdom is where the first men came from originally, maybe some of these gods were brought in Westeros as well, like Mist, the Griffins, the Storm gods, etc. Great point. Yeah, I mean, we saw the Griffins and some of these guys, these god statues. That's why some of these, like Durandon and the storm gods that he so-called warred with, and Garth Greenhand, and yeah, maybe those were actually brought across. Maybe Garth Greenhand was a figure in Essos that's been forgotten, but is still remembered in Westeros. Things like that. Yeah. Great point, Palavan. Okay, folks, let us move on to the cities of the Sarn. As we said at the beginning, Dany passed a lot of them. As mentioned recently, the Valyrian roads in the southern regions of the kingdom exist, connecting the city of Asaria, now known as Vaes Kadach. Qohor, which is the closest of the free cities to where Sarnor was, used to be 10 times wealthier because of the nearby, quote, gleaming Alamaster cities, shining lakes, and fertile farms. Trade with the Sarnor made them rich. It was like they were part of the trade network that made Sarnor itself rich within itself, and Qohor were so close by that they scooped up a lot of that, had a lot of their own trade goods to offer, being in the forest of Qohor with all those cool like timber and cool pine cones and lemurs and whatever else trade goods they had. Pretty cool. The Sarnori cities were competitive with each other as independent city-states, but they also seemed to specialize, like filling niches within the Sarnori kingdom to create a greater whole. Here's another grand, evocative quote.
Their gleaming cities were strewn across the grasslands like jewels across a green velvet mantle, shining beneath the light of sun and stars. The greatest of these cities was Sarnath of the Tall Towers, where the High King dwelt in his fabled palace with 1,000 rooms. Eastward rose Sath, city of caravans, Sathar, the waterfall city, at the juncture of two branches of the Sarn, Gornath by the lake with its canals, Salash by the silver shore, city of scholars with its vast library and painted walls. Downstream, where the Sarn turned north, the prosperous river cities Rathalar, Hornoth, and Keith served. Sorry,
Keith, yeah.
Yeah, no, I was like, Keith. And Keith served the ships that plied her deep blue waters. Here, too, stood Mardosh, the city of soldiers, renowned as Mardosh the Unconquerable. At the delta, where the Sarn splintered and flowed into the shivering sea, could be found the port cities Sath to the west and Saris to the east.
Man, that really feels like Tyrion going down the Rhine, like relating all the ancient Rhoynar cities and their specialties and their pink marble. Or
They sound similar.
Yeah.
Like they just like waterfall cities. Like one of the Rhoynar cities is known for waterfalls.
Here
for
we have
example.
another one. Yeah, you're totally right. Yeah, you're keying in on these connections. Is there's a lot of little pointing. Go, okay, that's similar. That's kind of similar. That's kind of similar. And there's so many reasons for the similarity. Again, the proximity of these races, the proximity of their regions, and similar upbringing, similar attitude, similar look. Yeah, the Rhoynar were
geography.
Yeah, the Rhoynar were brown-skinned as well. I mean, that fits. At least it's a basic similarity, but it's notable.
Yeah, you mentioned the black hair and black eyes thing, but I just want to highlight that again. I mean, I think it's notable to say black eyes specifically.
Yeah, that's not super standard either. Yeah, so
it's-
that's a notable similarity. You're right. So Kasath, city of caravans, it says. So obviously, that's a sign of lots of trade, widespread, and going long distances overland. And from Sarnor, if you're looking at the map, you can imagine there's so many different directions they could go. They could go west to the free cities, to Qohor, south to the Rhoyne, all along the Rhoyna cities, south to Valyria, to Slaver's Bay, east to the more mysterious lands that we know less about, down to Karth, through the Bone Mountains, across to Yee. I mean, there's a lot of possibilities there. Sathar, the waterfall city, as Ashea just said. That's evocative and reminds us of the Rhoynar. Gornath by the lake with canals. That sounds pretty amazing. That's one of the farthest out, closest to what's now the Dothraki Sea. Salash.
I just wondered, we have like this, I just realized we have Nath at the end, at the double A, and then we have all these like Sarnath, Gornath. Do you think the Nathi, do you think they have a root as well then?
No, you never know. I hadn't thought of that. It's pretty similar.
I think so.
Yeah, I think it makes sense. I mean, again, I keep saying, do you think these people have a root? And then I'm like, wait, I guess I think everyone really has a root to the Sarnori, like when I think about it. But it seems like another direct connection, especially when you think about names and like coloring and stuff like that.
Yeah, and like it's kind
of like the Nathi are the combination of when the Sarnori and the Children of the Forest and the Ifakevron like bred.
Oh, they're a different version of like the Crannogmen, maybe
they're like the Crannogmen of Essos. Yeah, that's my theory here.
That makes sense. Yeah, it'd be like the Nathi were more like the children merged with like a brown-skinned race, and the there's just like a white-skinned race.
Yeah,
merging.
basically, that's kind of what it seems like.
That's cool. That's kind of neat to think about. And there's such a closeness with nature, and that's apparently been present for so long, and so Gornath by the lake with its canal sounds pretty neat. Salash by the silver shore. Oof, that's really evocative. City of scholars. It's on the lake. It's the one Sarnori city here that we mentioned that's not on the Sarn. It's on probably the edge of what they think was the Silver Sea. It says Salash by the silver shore. Like that can't not be connection, right? That's got to be a similar reference. So maybe that's where they think the edge was or something. Vast library and painted walls this place had. Just, man, it was the old town, the citadel of the Sarn, basically. The Sarndidal. And, a sad thing. It's amazing how sad it is to lose that, even though it's completely fictional. It wasn't actually ever written. We didn't really lose it, but it still hurts, doesn't it? It's like all that literature, all this fake literature lost, all this fake history lost. No!
You think it's a Library of Alexandria equivalent?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a lot of, the Library of Alexandria is there's a lot of unknowns about it, but basically, it was a center of knowledge that was destroyed or fell apart or both. And this seems like Salash was inspired by that to some degree. Sarnath of the Tall Towers was in the center, like the center of the river, the center of the Sarnori kingdom, and was the seat of the High King. As the capital, it has its own quote. Sean.
Even in the Seven Kingdoms, the glory of Sarnath of the Tall Towers was celebrated, and Lomas Longstrider included the palace with 1,000 rooms amongst his 9 wonders made by man. Today, however, the kingdom of Sarnor is largely forgotten, and there are many and more in Westeros, even students at the Citadel, who know little and less of its long, proud history.
So there was the one that Ashea pronounced Keith, which it could be Kith, like,
Yeah, I think I should have said
Mike
Kith,
Tyson
just because...
telling stuffed animals what to do.
Yeah, I think I should have said Kith, because Keith just makes me laugh.
Or
the
Kith,
of, like,
maybe? I don't know. But Kyth. Say it how you want. Hornoth, city of the horny, another shipbuilding city. Like Kyth, Keith, Rathalar, same. Mardosh the Unconquerable, which Shea laughed at when you said that name, or when you read that name.
Because they were conquered.
Clearly they were conquered, but they were the hardest to conquer. They at least, sort of lived up to their name. They were conquerable, but what it was, the city of soldiers. The Saris to the east of the Sarn at the mouth on the east side, and Sath on the west. Saris used to fight the Ibanites for the region, so they used to have a long-standing ancient war against them to control the mouth of the river.
Do you think they were often sorry about that?
They were sorry about that. But here's how you remember which is Sath and which is Saris. Sar is Sareast and Southwest. Southwest. Southwest Airlines used to exist over there until the Dothraki came. Today, Sath is the only surviving Sarnori city. There's 20,000 tall men still living there. Tall men and women, I assume. If it's all men, they're really screwed. Small port.
Or none.
Small port with white walls. It does still, again, connect to the Valyrian roads. Trades with Ib and Lorath to this day. And it's still there. I kind of doubt it's going to come up in the story, but it's interesting to know that it's still there. So if anyone ever writes future stories, RPG, Maybe just in the far future when HBO's still making new TV shows about Game of Thrones 10, 20 years from now, they'll be like, let's do Sarnor, and then we'll get something like this. We'll get to see that, or who knows?
Well, if we do like the Sea Snake Exploring the World TV series, which is one of the
Actually,
concepts.
that's a great point. Yeah.
He could easily go up. I mean, I think it would make perfect sense if he would go up to Ib, that he would, see Sath or
check
something.
out Sath and see what's there. Maybe try to buy some old artifacts from them. He's rich.
Yeah.
So let's take a look at Daenerys 3 Game of Thrones. We already saw Daenerys 4 when she's at base Dothraki. Here's On the Way. We get another description of some of these ruined cities that we can be pretty sure are Sarnori. Quote,
they crossed the rolling hills of Norvos, past terraced farms and small villages where the townsfolk watched anxiously from atop white stucco walls. They forded 3 wide, placid rivers and a 4th that was swift and narrow and treacherous, camped beside a high blue waterfall, skirted the tumbled ruins of a vast dead city where ghosts were said to moan among blackened marble columns.
So Nina did a little work here. Let's go with her takes. The Khalasar crosses the Upper Rhoyne and the Darkwash, but from Daenerys' journey in the Lands of Ice and Fire and the World of Ice and Fire app, it looks like it also crosses tributaries of the Sarn at least twice. Maybe the one that's mentioned in this quote that says swift and narrow and treacherous. That could be it. Dany's journey also appeared to take her just north of Yali Kamai, which is formerly Sathar, the so-called city of waterfalls. Maybe the Khalasar, maybe that natural waterfall they camped by was one of those waterfalls that fit and that gave the city its epithet. Then the vast dead city where ghosts were said to moan amongst blackened marble columns. The fact that it was a vast dead city might be the Yali Kamai, might still be Sathar, the same waterfall city, or it might be Vojor Sambi, formerly Kasath, whose Dothraki name means the broken gods, for these temples and statues cast down by the conquerors. Or it could even be what's now called Vase Kewo, or Kiwo, which is Sarnath itself, the tall towers, which Dothraki now call City of Worms.
I like the idea that it was Kasath, the city of caravans, because they were themselves a caravan coming through.
Oh,
they
following
were
around.
traveling, I just think that this is nice.
That is a good call. Very good idea. Y'all, if you have ideas on which is which, send them our way. We have a wrap-up episode coming in a few weeks to retrace our steps and cover questions that we missed, cover mistakes that we missed, bits and pieces here, things that got cut from episodes because the episode was too long. We got a lot of good stuff. And It's a perfect time for us to catch up on your comments that apply to episodes that are already in the can.
Yeah, it's definitely good to highlight that this is your chance. If you've been trying to get us to talk about something that we just keep missing every week, then send us another email and remind us.
Yeah. Now, let's briefly return to the concept of real-world influences. Remember, we mentioned the King Sargon of Babylon. Again, the Sar prefix just looms large there. The city Mardosh sounds a bit like Marduk, who was the chief god of Babylon, defeated the leader of the Anunnaki gods, Tiamat. You all remember Tiamat from D&D, and Tiamat's a real world.
Kind of reminds me of the Dosh
god.
Colleen, too, because it's like the
Dosh
Mardosh.
Colleen,
There's like
Dosh.
that. I don't know. I think a lot about these languages. I'm so
That's
curious.
a good point, yeah. Tiamat was a primordial sea dragon who was a storm, and Marduk was a storm god and god of judgment and other things. Marduk was around for so long that you got attributed a lot of different aspects, like Zeus, and lots of these ancient gods just kept getting more and more like titles. Like Danny, just keep getting more titles. Mardonius, also kind of similar to Mardosh, was a key Persian general under Xerxes, the Persian emperor who saw the Persian Empire at its greatest height, and was also featured very inaccurately in the movie 300.
And is our cat.
What's that? And our cat, Xerxes, yes. The most important Xerxes of all. The Kassites are people from that same era who lived, another Iranian people, and that sounds a bit like Kasath. They get the Sath and the Kas together, but in the other order. And Essaria, that Valyrian city that has Valyrian roads that connect to the kingdom of Sarnor, sounds a lot like Assyria, and Assyria was a neighbor and constant trading partner / foe to Babylon. So, yeah, there's some pretty good fits there. Now, earlier you brought up Nath, Ashay. I'm so glad you did that because I already have Nath
researched
here briefly. Nath is an Indian suffix meaning lord. There's actually a lot of Indian suffixes that mean lord. Aziz is an Arab name that means lord. So yeah, it's just a lot of things mean lord. Now, Lovecraft says he came up with the name Sarnath on his own. And he probably did, but it's a coincidence because it's also a city in India. There is a city in India called Sarnath. Boom. How about that?
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, sometimes you come up with on your own. Sometimes it's in your subconscious real deep. Like, I have my name happens to be an example of that, Ashaya, because my dad said he had a dream where I came and said my name was going to be Ashaya. That's why I'm named Ashaya, is that he had a dream. Well, my dad's a hippie who has studied a lot of like Sanskrit. He's Jewish, so he studied Hebrew. And Ashaya is a word in Sanskrit and Hebrew and Vulcan and a bunch of other things. So clearly that got in there. So maybe Lovecraft like had seen the name Sarnath at some point.
He might have, yeah. Now, of course, Lovecraft was like super poor, but he went to the library.
Yeah.
Public library. You never know what he learned there.
I gotta say, it reminds me of Sauron.
Oh yeah, okay. Sauron, yeah. He's a little put a little bitterness into it. Sauron, like yeah.
Yeah.
That's the lime getting in there. Sauron has lime stiffened hair or lime stiffened tongue, maybe.
Lime stiffened eyelashes.
Yeah. Imagine that. That would be painful. Yeah. Let's put bleach in our eyes. Yeah, that sounds good. So we've talked about the individual cities. Let's talk about it as a whole. The Kingdom of Sarnor, the title of the episode. That's this current section. Let's get into that. We've talked about the lands and the ancient history. We've talked about the people and the cities and some IRL influences. Over the time the city is formed, it's more appropriately called a confederation probably, but whatever, semantics. It's a kingdom of sorts, and here's a quote to describe that, perspective, that attitude. Here we go.
The kingdom of Sarnor, so called, though it boasted 20 rival kings, was amongst the world's great civilizations for more than 2,000 years. Yet much of what we know of them comes only from fragments of their otherwise lost histories, most notably the Summer and Winter Annals, and records of them from Qarth, Slaver's Bay, and the Free Cities. Sarnori traders traveled to Valyria and Et, to Ling and Ashai. Sarnori ships sailed the Shivering Sea to Ib and the Thousand Islands and Far Masovi. Not sure how to say that.
Yeah.
Sarnori kings warred against the Kothi and the Old Empire of Geese and led many of a foray against the bands of nomadic horsemen who roamed the steppes to their east.
Mm-hmm. So all the big names come up there, right? Yeti, Ashai, Lang, Valyria, Thousand Islands, even a few that we haven't heard much of. Far Masovi, Geese as well. That's not an uncommon one. The Kothi, like all the big names, right? That's a lot of global trade and wealth. I mean, and if we said, it says they have Sarnori ships sailing all over, but it seems like most of it was land-based trade. They're in the center of the grasslands. Sure, they could sail down the river and then sail out into the sea and go around. But
can I say real
that's
quick,
no way to get to Valyria.
just on the subject of Masovi.
Sure.
Do you think of Muscovy? Do you think of Russia?
Yes,
Yeah, okay,
100%.
I just want to mention that.
It's also kind of fitting, like in the
like
real
where
world,
they
like Russia would be a
are
little farther east, yeah,
So like the kind of culture,
of
anyway.
like Iran, yeah.
So
Really.
they went to Russia. Okay.
Yeah, one day when we do like a full Essos thing where we look at it as a big whole, we'll talk about that one because it's too small of a category on its own. But that's when places like Masovi and Nefer will come up. So a lot of these nations are really distant. I mean, Yeti is mentioned, like the overland route to Yeti we mentioned earlier. That goes through the Bone Mountains. The sea route would be even longer. I mean, maybe it wouldn't take as long, but it is a lot larger distance because you got to go all the way around. You got to go west. To go east, you must go west. You got to sail all the way around Essos, all the way around Valyria, all the way through the Jade Gates. I mean, that is wicked long, like multi-year journey probably, if not at least a year. I don't know, but a long dang time. So this is an idea I want to reinforce because it's true in real life as well. Modern historians have discovered or rediscovered, because obviously people at the time knew what they were doing, had trading networks far larger and more distant than had been believed or assumed by modern historians. We're learning now that, I think I used this example before, the Bronze Age was all throughout Europe and so many other places, right? But bronze, you need to make bronze, you need copper and tin. And one of the only places tin existed in all of Europe was in England. All the tin everywhere that was all the bronze being made everywhere across Europe had to use tin from England. So that just proves there was a trade network. Like, how it's impossible for it to have happened any other way than trade, So here we see again just really ancient, vast, distant trade networks. Now these are a little more civilized people, but we can imagine that even before they reached these peaks of civilization, they were still trading really long distances when they were still like, some of them were still nomads, well, the ones who had settled in cities are the ones doing this super long distance trading, but we don't have to assume they were high civilization only when they got to this point, although it is maybe what helped them get to that point.
Along that same line, Aziz, I think that the barbarians that the Romans were conquering, quote unquote barbarians, they had borderline industrial production of wine. They had all sorts of roads and transportations and trade, and they're very advanced networks of culture, civilization, trade, government, on and on and on. We called them barbarians when attacked them so we could get their gold, but it was very vast, worked out network of commerce.
Right on, yeah. So interestingly, there seems to be very little, not none, but very little conflict with Valyria. They were just as close to the Giscari and the Quathai cities, but they did fight them. Probably because common sense, like, don't fight the ones with dragons, but the rest, sure, fight them. You can probably beat them. Yeah, just don't fight the ones with dragons. Trade with them. Maybe they had good relationships with them. It says that the great grass sea that separated Valyria and Sarnor was a impediment to either wanting to fight the other, and they were both so wealthy that trading made more sense. When nations get so powerful that they have so much wealth, the people at the top have very little incentive to go to war with another really powerful nation that they're actively profiting huge amounts from. So that might be part of it. They're both so powerful and wealthy that they just didn't, the incentive just wasn't there for either of them.
Also, if they're farther away, it's harder to get your military there.
Yeah.
And then once you conquer them, it's hard to maintain control over them.
Yeah, because as we talked about with Valyria, their power was so concentrated in Valyria. Like, Sarnor is pretty far away. Like, how are you going to rule? Like, it's one thing to rule free cities because they're individuals and you can insult, but how do you rule a whole kingdom? They would have to have smashed it pretty big and reduced it to, separate regions and maybe redesignate new states within it to properly administer. And then who wants to do all that? Someone might, but it's not an easy thing.
Especially if you already have trade established and they're not a threat to you.
Yeah, there would be elements within Valyria that would be like, no, let's not fight them. There's so many other people we can go pick on that are just pushovers that we're not actively making lots of money from. So yeah, there's plenty of reasons why, even if they're not entirely clear. Nina has a take on this as well. She says, interesting that it never seemed to go the other way either. With the exception of the Sarnori enslaved by the Valyrians after the defeat of Gis in the Fourth Giscari War, the Valyrians appear to have never been interested in conquering the Sarnori or extending their empire to the Sarn. Maybe it was a fear of overextension, like Sean expressed, that the farther east the freehold conquered and established itself, the harder it would be to put down rebellions in various parts of the empire. Sure, dragons can get there quickly, but the armies can't, and you need the armies. Dragons alone aren't going to be enough. Dragons are great for threatening them and keeping them in line, but once the armies are in the field, that's a different matter. Maybe the Valyrians just never saw the Sarnori as a threat, but did see them as a profit source. That because the local Sarnori kings were just as willing to sell out their neighbors and even their high king as they were to work with them. The Valyrians saw them as useful temporary allies rather than a power that needed to be crushed. Maybe it was because the Valyrians saw the geographical advantages of the kingdom of Sarnor not worth the investment of long military campaigns, much less several, because they saw how many wars it took to subjugate the Giscari. It took 5 wars, right? Even though Valyria won all 5 of them. That's how much, that's a lot of effort. Yeah, they won every single time, but if they had wanted to dominate Slaver's Bay right away, they probably wouldn't have taken 5 wars. Probably would have just settled it after the first one. But apparently they tried to let Giscari, the Giscari be something that they ruled over, and it just kept being a problem, or I'm not sure exactly, but clearly they didn't try to settle it all at once. Nina continues here. She says the Valyrians already had the fertile, not yet disputed lands in the Great Rhoyne, as well as access to the Shivering Sea from Andalos into the Summer Sea via the Valyrian Peninsula itself. If the Sarnori didn't want what the Valyrians had, and they seemed to keep more or less to themselves, and the Valyrians didn't want what the Sarnori had, then yeah, it's just, she makes another reason here for them not to fight. So it seems like we have several compelling reasons for them not to fight much, if at all. Even if we can't hone in on which reasons were the most important, it seems like we have a nice arsenal of options here. Now, the Rhoynar aren't mentioned here. We've mentioned them a lot.
Sorry, I just got to point out the irony of a nice arsenal of options for peace.
Yeah, right. a little verisimilitude there. Opposite of the Rhoynar. Say the Rhoynar aren't mentioned. We've mentioned them several times, but they're not mentioned here. That's curious, right? They'd have been closer than Giscari, closer than all these others, and reachable by land. So I wonder if that's just an oversight by the Maesters, by Yandel, or just the information isn't there. But we've spent so much time mentioning all the similarities, the proximity, common cultural heritage, the potential for shared water magic, things like that. It seems pretty likely they would have traded with each other as well. I mean, given the proximity. It's not mentioned, but it's a pretty safe assumption. It isn't specifically mentioned here that they traded with Qohor either. It's mentioned elsewhere that they did, so it's a safe assumption. Let's see. Actually, it does say the free cities. I'm rereading the quote, but anyway, I figure it's. I don't think there's much to read into the Rhoynar being left out of that particular quote. Nina also expands on the topic. She says, "I wonder how much kinship the tall men saw between themselves and the Rhoynar. Not so much in blood relations, since probably most peoples of Central Essos had the same or similar ancestral links. So that, in other words, she's saying that connection is there, but a lot of people would have that same connection. So maybe it's not such a unique connection, but cultural connections as well, not just the blood connections, cultural connections. Those are more important, more defined, more easy, especially for people of this era to be able to figure out, because they obviously aren't looking at DNA, but they can look at things like common origins, cultural traits, similar physical features. They were both peoples who identified themselves with major regional rivers, the Rhoyne and the Sarn, and while it's unclear whether the Sarnori actually worshipped the Sarn or the Silver Sea, the latter at least definitively seems to have been connected to their gods, since the Fisher Queens, who lived on the Silver Sea, were specifically, quote, favored of the gods. So that's a pretty strong indication. The Sarnori had their all-important river, the Rhoynar had theirs, and so they would keep to their respective domains. Yeah. Well said, Nina.
Bring up a thought about records of trade between Sarnori and Rhoynar, and just in general. I feel like there probably is a huge gap in the histories for the Rhoynar, and that specifically in that quote, it says, comes from fragments of their otherwise lost histories, records of them from Karth, Slaver's Bay, and the Free Cities. Well, the Rhoynar cities were destroyed by fire and water.
They would have had records destroyed too.
Yeah, like they're of all the they would have had the most destroyed records, I think. Like
advanced archaeology could search the ruins of these cities and they might find Sarnori trade goods, and that would prove something.
Yeah, in that case,
or vice versa.
But there aren't going to be records. There, all of them would have been burned up or destroyed in the floods.
Yeah, good point. Yes, well, point, Ashea. So the people who managed the kingdom of Sarnor, we hear about individual kings of individual cities, or maybe they're more properly called city-states. It's not necessarily important to have the designation. It's more important to get the concept down. But we have the High Kings of Sarnor, a.k.a. the Azor Ahai Kings. This is another similarity to ancient Persia. Cyrus the Great, Xerxes, Darius, and others were referred to as King of Kings, which is, in effect, the same thing. Ooh, that rhymed. But these real-world examples probably held more power than is indicated by this quote.
By law and custom, all the lesser Sarnori kings were subject to the High King, but in truth, very few of the High Kings ever exercised any real power.
The term High King seems to originate in England, but the equivalent term exists all over the place, like King of Kings, or Emperor is pretty similar, but King of Kings is a softer title. It doesn't sound quite as aggressive as Emperor.
Really? Oh,
yeah.
It's Emperor. I thought you were going to say it's High King.
Sorry. Oh, yeah. High King is also a little softer.
Yeah, High King sounds softer than King of Kings. But
High King is more like when you say first among equals. That's more like that. When Emperor is like, no, first. There's no period.
King of Kings is like saying I'm better than all of you to me too.
It is, but it's marketing. It's like that's why it's similar. Like when you get into it, it's the same thing, but it's like marketing. It's supposed to sound a little softer.
I think of the High King or a High King would be among the different kings the most powerful or the most senior or maybe some greater claim, but not necessarily powerful or greater enough to be over all the other kings. Maybe over any other one, but not all of them. But the King of Kings, he's over all the rest of them. They're
Yeah.
all subjects to him.
And yeah, so there's tons of real world examples of this and tons of in-world examples of this.
What about the King of Queens?
King of Queens?
That's a TV show that I don't know much about.
Yeah, I don't know much about that show either, other than it exists.
You don't need to.
Nina writes, unlike other High Kings, the High Kings of Dorne along the Greenblood, who were, quote, chosen by election from amongst a dozen noble families that had settled along the river or eastern shores, the High Kings of the Iron Islands, which were selected by Kingsmoot among the captains and kings of the islands, there's no sense of how High Kings of Sarnor were chosen, but it sounds like the High King was the king only of Sarnath. Only the central city there, the chief city, was ever where the High King sat. So it wasn't an elected position, and it always came from the one city. But also it says here they didn't really have a lot of control over the other cities. It was kind of a, probably not as low power as, say, the Queen of England today, because she's not over other queens or kings, but where the title is somewhat symbolic, like that. And we're really curious.
I think of it maybe as like the senior senator and like in the U.S. Senate.
Okay.
They have more pull, right? People are more likely to pay attention to them. They're more likely to be able to pull in more votes or, sway an election or a bill. But they aren't specifically in charge of the other senators.
Their vote counts the same. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. People more likely to follow them. They want to stay in their good favor, but they don't have any specific legal authority over the others.
Right. So yeah, it is a really fascinating, interesting dynamic here that is kind of unclear, like how this could have, there probably were some pretty weak High Kings, given if it was dynastic, which it sounds like it was, there'd be some High Kings that they would really have ignored, and others where they would like, well, we might want to like give this guy what he wants because he's a little dangerous, or he's competent, and we don't want to get on his bad side because, it's unlikely that one city would have the power to truly dominate all the others. That's kind of the point of a balance of power here. But, you could easily find yourself in a situation where one city goes to war with another and all the others just sit out. And if it's Sarnath coming for you, they're the biggest of them, well, that leaves you in a tough spot. You don't want to be in that spot. So here's a related quote to build this subtopic a little bit further.
A proud and quarrelsome people, they were seldom ever united under a single ruler, but their kingdoms dominated the western grasslands, from the forests of Kohar to the eastern shores of the vanished Silver Sea and 50 leagues beyond.
All right, so really, really huge, quite huge, I have written here. Some of that domination was eventually probably financial, as we said. The trade networks and the merchants come in and spread their money around and do that. But I'm sure they used force pretty often as well, especially earlier on. And here's a quote about how they went into battle. Ashea.
Their riders wore steel and spider silk and rode coal-black mares, whilst the greatest of their warriors went to battle in scythed chariots pulled by teams of blood-red horses.
So shout out to TV tropes. I did some looking on the site TV tropes for
nice.
That's
one of my favorite sites ever.
It really helped get me in the right direction with some of these comparisons. I had already sussed out Persia for this, and I had sussed out Babylon and India. That was my own, but TV tropes turned me on to Scythia and the Sarmatians, which was really important here. And they also note there's a trope here, color I forget what it's called. It's like the color hierarchy, which is a common thing where lots of fantasy fictional kingdoms or places choose animals based on color. Like the red here, it says the blood red horses pulling the chariots. Remember, Khal Drogo's horse is a red, all blood red horse also, and it's like the finest herd in the. I don't know if he prefers red horses or just that particular horse is the best and it's red, but this is very specific. The riders wore steel and spider silk and roll coal black, so black horses for the individual cavalrymen, red horses for the chariots. You like that would make the army really like, wow, this is really organized and just distinct, and it would give it a little more like grandeur. I don't suppose that would make the Dothraki care. I don't suppose they would care at all, though. Wouldn't bother them. They'd be like, whatever, you fancy wimps. We also know from an obelisk, a Valyrian obelisk, this was the one Nina mentioned earlier, that shows a record of the Fourth Valyrian Giscari War, that at least in one era, maybe not for the entire 2,000 years of their existence, the soldiers in the Sarnori kingdom wore high helms, perhaps to make themselves even taller. Like they're tall. Like let's press that advantage and get super tall, kind of like the stilt walkers on Slaver's Bay, but not ridiculous like those.
I wonder if that might have also been a command tactic to be able to identify where your leader is, what direction the soldier should be going, especially if they use any kind of signals.
Yeah, the Romans did that. Those plumes, that was also for height, but also to be able to identify like the ranks and the commander and all that. Yeah, and different nations have done different things like that. Like Native American tribes have different ornamentation for that. A lot of that's just like I did something, so I get the feather in my cap, quite literally. But still, it's it's a similar concept of wearing your rank on your head, in a chaotic situation.
Modern armies have gone almost the other direction. They try to subdue and hide the ranks because it's easier to target, especially when we have missile weapons to take them out. And B, we have radios to communicate for a long distance anyway, so we don't want to be like, "Hey, I'm the leader."
It's even worse now with drone spotting, and there have been 8 Russian generals killed in Ukraine, which is just an incredibly high number for modern warfare. So
I feel like that's pretty sloppy on the Russians' part too. I don't know.
Well, it indicates what I read from our friend, the urban warfare expert John Spencer, who was on the podcast years ago with Max Brooks talking about some Game of Thrones stuff. He said that it indicates distrust in the lower ranking officers. The generals go there personally because they don't trust the lower ranking officers to get the job done. So they're at the front lines for that reason. Yeah. Anyway, let's stay out of the real world as much as we can for modern events like that are ongoing. We like the real world ancient stuff, but modern stuff, we don't want to get too into stuff that evokes feelings. We don't want to have feelings about that right now.
And that we can be less certain about. We don't have proper
right.
context of history to look at it.
You're right. This is all ongoing. So super ancient warfare, scythe chariots. None of those are in Ukraine right now. Or if the Russians are using those, talk about primitive. No. Scythe chariots were a feature of Persia. So again, a connection to the ancient Persian Empire, the Achaemenids in particular, but probably before them as well. Scythe chariot sounds pretty badass. A chariot going at high speed with big scythes on the wheels. Actually, it's not a very good idea. Early on, people didn't know what to do with them. They were pretty badass. But eventually, armies knew how to handle them, and they became pretty weak. All you got to do is have a battle in a place where chariots can't go very fast or straight or at all, and they're worthless. Or you just get out of their way. They don't turn well.
They're not maneuverable. Yeah, it's hard to slow down and change directions. And once they're past you, it's easy to get them from behind.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So eventually, Alexander's troops, when they faced scythe chariots, they knew exactly what to do, and it was a horrible failure for the Persian armies. It was like they were using horses against tanks or something. Like, yeah, we know exactly how to deal with this. Go right ahead, y'all. Send those scythe chariots right at us. I can't imagine they were that effective against Dothraki either. They were probably crappy against the Dothraki, who were extremely maneuverable and had arrow horse archers. That seems like a terrible idea.
A lot of times you have an innovation that seems really good, but it's really good as a supplement, not as a main force.
Yeah.
And if you can really create an Achilles heel for yourself if something is meant to supplement or is good in unique situations, if that's your entire force. Archers are really good, but a combination of archers and cavalry are better.
Yes.
Cavalry is really good, but a combination of cavalry and infantry are better.
Yeah, and it's like archers and infantry are really good. What if you have, both? Yeah, and then the Dothraki are that. They're light cavalry and archers in one. Pretty hard to top.
Never mind the logistical cost between those things too, right? Archers eventually going to run out of arrows. It takes a lot more material to build chariots and then to feed the horses and so on, So
yeah, and this is men and women fighting together is part of it here. That's, as we said, this is also similar to the Rhoynar. The Rhoynar had warrior women, though in this case, the women had a very specific common role. We don't exactly know. As far as we know, the Rhoynar women just fought alongside the men in the same roles. Here, it seems more specific. They were often the chariot drivers. In ancient Greece, that was a very high status position. Persia as well. But still subordinate to whatever noble they were driving the chariot for, obviously. It suggests it was usually like a father or wife or daughter. I assume aunts and nieces and cousins got in there sometimes too. Now, it's interesting because in ancient Greece, you mentioned Achilles at Achilles' heel. And I was like, oh, that reminds me. Because like the Greeks used chariots too, but not to fight. They just used them to get from place to place. Like Achilles in the movie Troy is portrayed as riding his chariot to the battle, but not in the battle. It's like a taxi. He's like, Uber me to the battlefield. And then he gets off his chariot and then, fights on foot, right? So there's a lot of that as well.
I think there's even a little debate in a lot of early chariots. Maybe they were just carts and not chariots.
Yeah, it may as well just be a cart. Yeah. Cartiot, chariot is a similar word, right? Same. Nina says, the reliance on chariots underlines the Sarnori as a foil and contrast to the Dothraki, where the Dothraki ride horses themselves, relegating only youngest, most infirm to carts, right? Viserys was the Kalragat, the cart king, which was a deep insult. So I can imagine the Dothraki not only look down on chariots as a weapon of war, but just in general, as you cart rider, you ragat or whatever that is. So, yeah, so just plenty of things for the Dothraki to have contempt for the Sarnori. So, yeah, I wonder if they just were stubborn, like it was a noble thing, a part of the noble culture, and they just couldn't get away from their chariots, or maybe the chariots were gone longer before we're told. Maybe the chariots were out of fashion, but it says they were around in the final battles. So, I guess they just never moved past that old style. The fools.
I can also imagine it still might have been almost like I was saying, a piece of their military, but not the centerpiece, something that the commanders use to get back and forth, to transfer information, or even to carry materials, to carry, swords, repair parts, food, water, arrows, etc.
Now, the idea that armies don't adjust to modern warfare isn't unrealistic at all. I mean, look at, say, the French in World War I. That was one of the biggest earth-shifting changes, was comparing World War I to earlier wars when there wasn't like mechanized infantry and machine guns and things like that. The French just kept sending battalions to be mowed down with their honorable, noble, frontline like attitude towards war, and they would just get thousands of people slaughtered over and over. Just kept sending them charging into machine gun fire over and over and over. And it's infuriating to think about. Even it happened 100 years ago, but it's like, geez, just learn something. Just adjust. This is not working. But yeah, they just anyway. So it's if the Sarnori just kept using chariots against the Dothraki and kept not working. That is realistic, as dumb as it sounds. So
it was one reason casualties were so high in the Civil War too.
Yeah.
Like guns got better, but they were just still walking out in the field,
charging like they were still using swords and spears. Yeah, just like armor doesn't work against those bullets, man. Not well, anyway. So yeah, so in the early days, they subjugated the Sumeri, the Zikor, and the Gips. We mentioned them with the Azor Ahai anecdotes. They apparently fought with Valyria against the Giscari. That seems like a opportunism. Was like they knew which side to take. They could see who was going to lose. After the first war went the Valyrians' way, they're like, they're going to fight them again? Let's help and get a share of the plunder. Oh, you're doing it again. Let's do that again the third time. The fourth time, some silly Sarnori cities fought for the Giscari. Like, what? Why would you do that? They lost the first 3 times. You're like, this is the time they're going to beat the dragons. But some Sarnori cities stayed with the Valyrians. So you've got split alliances there, which goes to show the independence level of these cities. Possibly a decline in their decision-making, similar to this just insistence on chariots, but also it's an indication of that greed was ruling them. They weren't thinking about keeping themselves safe or protecting their people. They were just driven by rivalries and pride and, what else explains these bad decisions, To me, it seems you keep it simple with things like this. They're focused on enriching themselves. They're corrupt, very like the Carthene people we see that Dany's exposed to. Thousands of years of corruption make them into these wildly exotic versions of long-term corruption. The Palace of 1,000 Rooms was what we have for Sarnor, and in the Karth there's the 100 thrones or whatever, and like every single dude is sitting on a throne in this one room. It's crazy. It's like this is what this reminds me of, right? Like these guys are just so far detached from reality. They've been rich, absurdly rich for so long, for so many generations, that they just don't. They have this, what they want, they get, so they extend that to all forms of reality. Like the Dothraki will not defeat us because I'm the great, gang guy Azor Ahai. That's a name I just made up. And I get what I want. Like, it's like as if your projection can change reality,
Yeah, and as you're going to get into, it's pretty easy to come up with some Sarnori sounding names, huh?
Yeah.
You just did it right there. That was fun.
Yeah, just put those eyes at the end.
The ors and the amai.
Yeah, the ors, the sars, the naths. You just, there's a mix of those, right? They also fought against Braavos. Apparently that didn't go well. I mean, they fought Braavos at sea, which that almost never goes well. Like, maybe this was early on when Braavos was new and they didn't know people didn't realize how well the Braavosi were at sailing. But the last war fleet the Sarnori ever commissioned was sunk by the Sea Lord of the time. They were fighting over a place called Bitterweed Bay. Right, if you're looking at the map, it's this dip in the continent between the Axe and the Sarn. So it is pretty close to where the Sarnori operate, but yep, they lost. Apparently that's the site of many battles. Lots of, something like the World of Ice and Fire says there's like 50,000 ships sank there, or 50,000 dead sailors and 10,000 ships or something like that. 1,000 ships, I think it was. Anyway, 1,000 is that standard, just big number that could be a lot more. On the delta of the Sarn now, there's a Lorathi colony called Morash, which is interesting. That's probably a newer thing. Probably after this Kingdom of Sarnor fell, this opened the door for something like this. They did fight against the Dothraki before the Dothraki emerged to annihilate them, back when the Dothraki were more contained. And this was probably a thing they did to like make themselves look cool. Like a noble Sarnor would go fight some Dothraki, come home and be like, I waged war on the Dothraki. I am a cool guy. You give me a claim now, But why did we call this the Azor Ahai Kings? Why did I say that? Well,
they're high kings.
First, because I like puns. A high king. They're high kings. But the naming convention, we don't have a lot of Sarnori names on record, but they all sound like Azor Ahai. Check it out. Huzor Ahai.
Every one of them?
Every single one of them. Check this out. Huzor Ahai. Mazor Alexei. Okay, that's all. Those are the only Sarnori names we have. All of them sound like Azor Ahai. Those two, which comprises all of them.
But they really do.
Like Mazor, Azor. Huzor, Azor. Amai, Ahai. Like Alexei, Ahai. Like, yeah, that is real similar. So, what do we make of that? I honestly don't know. I'm kind of stuck on it.
What I take of it is that Azor Ahai came from Sarnor. That was where the Azor Ahai figure came from. And again, to be clear, Aziz and I think Shun maybe feels similarly, there were a lot of figures that were part of the savior of humanity. There wasn't just one Azor Ahai. It was the many-faced Azor Ahai. But one of them was from Sarnor.
And may have literally had this name.
Yes, may have literally had this name. He was the eponymous Azor Ahai, but that there would have been others that have been mentioned in other episodes.
Yeah, like Nefer has whatever, the one guy. Yeti has Yintar.
Yeah, Yintar.
There's just all these different heroic
Yintar
figures.
isn't the same person as Azor Ahai. We don't think that. It's not canon. We don't know. It is possible that they are one and the same person. There's one figure that is the same, but probably Yintar worked with Azor Ahai, etc.
But this may have been the guy, like the main guy. If there was a main guy, if any of them had the main guy, it was here. It was a Sarnori person who emerged, and that would be interesting. That would make Azor Ahai would be a brown skinned person.
Yeah.
Cool.
You know what I mean? Like the Rhoynar, they have their tale about how the long night was stopped and about how all these, the people came together and sang a song that, stopped it. And so, they clearly know the tale too.
And that would have been close by. You're right. That would have been in close proximity. And so if Azor Ahai was an early Sarnori person from 10,000 years ago, before the long, or during the long night, before or during, or during, I mean, best guess, they were Sarnori. Like, it seems pretty solid. You know, just the naming convention alone is... It's not like there's other naming conventions out there in the world that are similar to this. So, at least not that we know of. Pretty strong evidence. So, folks, tell us what you think of that if you are so inclined. We think it's a pretty cool conclusion, a pretty solid conclusion, but one with a lot of potential historical ramifications that we may not have fully realized. Maybe you will be someone that figures out an additional important detail. Shall we move on to the fall of Sarnor, the ending for the of the Sarnori?
No, I don't want them to end. No, thanks.
Well, the fall is a lengthy portion. We've still got a good chunk left of this episode.
I did want to say real quick, whenever you say Azor Ahai hiking, in my mind I'm thinking Azor Ahai safari.
That's pretty good. So of what we know of Sarnor, it actually seems like the fall of Sarnor is the part we know the most about, like the largest vein of knowledge. If you were to carve up and categorize the things we know about it, the ending is the thing we have the greatest detail on. And some of that is telling. It is the most recent part of it. Like, it's the most recent part of their history is their end. But I think George also just has a penchant for exploring the root causes of civilizations falling, and he likes to show that a lot of times it's very similar things here. So many of these fallen kingdoms got really corrupt before they fell, got really wealthy before they fell. And those two things obviously go together. Greed perhaps being the most dominant of the things that rule over us. Is maybe a point he's making. Many of them, of the kingdoms that fell in Martin's world, didn't decline gradually. They fell pretty quickly. Not as quickly as the Doom of Valyria. It's hard to be quicker than that. But Sarnor fell fairly quickly considering how long they were around. We've given past examples of that. For example, Assyria. We talked about how Assyria was so big and so powerful for so long. But fast forward a couple hundred years later, even the people living in the ruins didn't know who built those ruins. And that takes us back to the beginning when Dany had no idea who these ruined cities were from, and which made that realistic. It made it sense that George didn't give us a name. So let's give some real-world examples to parallel here real quick. This isn't a deep dive, just an overview. I mentioned the Assyrians just now. Alexander the Great's invasion of Persia. Pretty good example, similarity, since Persia has come up so many times. A lot of the Persian cities ruled by the High King, kind of individual. They like the Dothraki, the Persians didn't take Alexander seriously at first. His army was pretty small, and so they were like, what's that small army going to do? Well, what it's going to do is conquer your entire empire. But they didn't take him seriously till too late, and maybe it wouldn't have mattered. They may have lost anyway. And it's a good example of the level of corruption that existed there, and it's something that I suspect happened at Sarnor as well, which is when Alexander unlocked the treasury of the Persian Empire, there was like the equivalent of 3 billion modern US dollars just sitting there gathering dust. He immediately reinvested into the Persian economy. He just started building temples, roads, churches. He spent like 75% of that, put it into the economy, and it was great. It was like, wow, this is, as far as conquerors go, this is could do a lot worse, And it's certainly and that's pretty telling. Now it didn't cause the fall of the Persian Empire. In fact, it made it better in a lot of ways. Of course, Alexander died like 10 years later, and it all collapsed and did get a lot worse. It did become civil war, and it did become awful. But it had a good start before it all went belly up. So that's a really strong parallel because the vast, mighty Persian Empire, probably the biggest empire of its time that ever existed until that point in history and stayed that way for a long time, fell apart pretty quickly because of, a threat they didn't take seriously. The Dothraki aren't that similar to Alexander, but it's still, a threat they took too lightly until it was too late. So because the Persian Empire didn't cease to exist because of that, we look at the Mongol invasions as another similar ending, like the end of the Islamic Golden Age, which has a lot of similarities to the fall of Sarnor. And the Mongol invasions, their policy was full destruction, which is very similar to the Dothraki. That was like a policy. For the Mongols, it was more a logistical warfare thing. For the Dothraki, it was more a religious thing. Same bottom line result: absolute annihilation. Books and scrolls, people, pets, farms, wells, everything. Just they put significant effort into destroying the place.
After they destroyed a city, after they sacked a city and killed every man, woman, child, and animal there, they would send a contingency back like 10 days later to make sure they got, if someone was hiding or if people were out getting water, just to make sure they got all the rest of them. It was just...
Yeah, no one ever took destruction as like thoroughly and like organized as the Mongols did, probably.
I think eventually Genghis Khan had advisors that convinced him to not kill everyone because they'd be better off if there were still people to farm the lands. That the land they were conquering wasn't as valuable without people to farm it. So eventually he's like, I guess I'll leave enough people alive to farm the land. I guess that makes sense. But he had no.
He was like, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Genghis Khan's like, yeah, I guess it makes sense. Genghis Khan in this case.
Yeah. And they weren't really. I don't think that there was like an empire like Sarnor as a whole that they were taking out. It was just different city states that were coming out. Maybe some smaller,
which is similar, yeah, like
empires.
Because like one of them was like the Sultan Bayezid, who ruled a huge territory and had a lot of different cities that were sort of like vassals to him, but he was kind of ruled them all. But there was a lot of picking off, and that was another feature of the Islamic Golden Age. It's a misnomer to say the Mongols were the only reason. Infighting made them weak and helped make the Mongols' job easier of destroying them, because they didn't unite to stop the existential threat, much like the Sarnori didn't.
But farther north, in I guess what would be like modern day Russia, Ukraine, and that area, as the Mongols came across, they failed to unite there as well. But I think there was less infighting. They were just more like, this is our city. You worry about your stuff. We'll worry about ours. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And after the Mongols just destroyed one after another, eventually they realized, okay, maybe we're going to have to help each other out.
Yeah.
But even then, it wasn't even close.
They still just didn't trust each other.
The largest army ever, and the Mongols just like with their like expeditionary force. It wasn't even like the main army. They just like rolled over them like it was nothing.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to go off too much on this, but almost the only reason, there's a lot of variables and factors, but pretty much the only reason they did just go all the way across France is because Genghis Khan died. And they're like, oh, well, I guess we should go back home now. But they were like easily winning every battle.
Yeah. There was some weather stuff that was starting to mess with them too, like the temperature, the regions, like it was getting to be a little too different for them. But still, you're right. That was basically, that's something we can come back to when we talk about the Dothraki, because they're obviously going to be the real world influence, the main part. Yeah. But yeah, so it's similar. They're similar to the fall of the Rhoynar. The Rhoynar also failed to unite against an existential threat. This is kind of like the Dothraki, though, that even if they had united against the Valyrians, they probably still would have lost. Like the Rhoynar weren't going to beat the dragons. They might have maybe managed a peace where they didn't go head to head. That maybe could have happened, but I don't even know about that. And the Rhoynar, the same thing. The Rhoynar took a while to unite. They didn't. The various princes didn't trust each other that much, and even when they allied, it was still kind of like keeping each other at arm's length. It wasn't full commitment, and bad.
One thing is, there's a difference between winning, losing, and being annihilated.
Yeah.
And sometimes if you put up enough of a fight that you don't win, but you are making it hard enough on the conqueror that they're willing to negotiate some sort of peace rather than totally annihilate you. And they failed to do that. So
yeah. And what's ironic about the Dothraki, who are very independent, is the Dothraki united against them. And that's ultimately like, which is kind of like what Genghis Khan did. He united the tribes, and that made them a huge force. Khal Mengo, apparently the first one to unite the tribes, and he showed that as a model. Like other Dothraki were like, oh, now we have something else to aspire to. Like the biggest, most powerful Dothraki Khals can now go, well, I can try to have the call of Khal, be the call of Khals or whatever, like do something kind of like what Drogo did, where he had a really huge Khalasar, but it still wasn't everyone. It still wasn't everyone. That's the true stallion that mounts the road, is supposed to truly unite all of the Dothraki into one huge Khalasar, which is Daenerys. She's the one who's doing that, really. That's another Azor Ahai tie-in right there. So so they failed to unite, and when they did, it may not have been enough. Although I do feel more strongly about the Rhoynar's cause being hopeless than the Sarnori. They may have been able to step up. I mean, let's be honest. Like dragons versus Dothraki screamers, you'd rather face Dothraki screamers. That's still really, really, really hard. But dragons are harder. I mean, so the Targaryen fall is another example. Their fall was slower. I'm talking about the Targaryens, not the Valyrian. The Valyrian fall was instant, but the Targaryens was more gradual, right? They had, if Aerys, the Mad King, had dragons, he would have either have gotten away with his atrocities or he would have gotten killed and a different Targaryen would have taken over, like Maegor. That's what happened to Maegor. Maegor was killed off and his nephew took over. And even during Aerys' time, there were people like, let's get rid of him and put Rhaegar on the throne. Even Rhaegar was like, yeah, maybe that's the right thing to do. But too slow, Rhaegar. But
he would have had more time if the Targaryens had dragons, though.
Yeah,
it wouldn't have been as easy for Ned to just launch into war if they had to face dragons. So,
and even after the Targaryens fell, the kingdom still existed. It was still the Iron Throne, still the kingdom of the Iron Throne. Though maybe that's going to not be there at the end of the books, though. So maybe we're still in the, historically speaking, this might be just a short intermittent phase before the Iron Throne vanishes. It's like, okay, the Targaryens died. Oh, the Iron Throne survived. Oh, well, but 20 years later, actually it didn't. It was just one or two or three more kings of House Baratheon before it was gone for good. So we're living in an important part of history here. Reading about an important part of history here. And it's going to shape maybe the way things are coming later.
I did have a thought I wanted to try to get in here.
Sure.
Sorry if it's not totally organized, but just the idea that some of these great conquerors, these great moments of accomplishment, quote unquote, like the Mongols coming across, they don't last very long, right? A couple generations and they kind of fade away. But the empires that really last, like Rome, maybe Westeros, they're based more on trade and diplomacy, negotiation, marriages than they are on warfare.
Yeah.
And I think that's
true.
Important to take note of, and maybe gives the Seven Kingdoms hope. I don't know.
Yeah, the Mongols are an exception because they actually did manage to turn into that. They went from this hyper aggressive, martial culture to they did establish huge trade routes and kind of settle into more of what we think of as a more normal kingdom. But because like Alexander, nope, couldn't pull that off. Julius Caesar, nope, stabbed to death like right after he got started. So Genghis Khan really is an exception there. So the doom that came to Sarnath, H.P. Lovecraft story from 1920, one of his earliest. I do recommend reading it. It's only 10 minutes long. Like a standard disclaimer, H.P. Lovecraft, terrible dude, but very influential author. He can't possibly benefit from you reading his work. It's all free. It's just out. The link that I read is hplovecraft.com. Every thing he's ever written is right there to read for free. There's no ads even. So you're not giving anyone money. And
he's not even alive to get money, right?
Oh,
so
no, he died poor and alone in 1940 at age 39 or 40. Yeah, he didn't have a good life.
Oh, that young.
He died young. Yeah, he had a bad upbringing. Both his mom got syphilis, his dad was abusive. Yeah, it was really plenty you could say about that. None of it good. So here is a quote from that story. You will recognize some of this. It will feel familiar, and it's pretty cool.
I could just read the whole story if it's only 10 minutes.
I considered that, actually.
When I saw you wrote that, I did consider that too. I was like, huh.
I could have. I could read the whole thing and release it separately as a recording. That'd be fun. Maybe I'll do that. Yeah, maybe I'll do that.
In lieu of that, we'll just do this couple of paragraphs here. After many aeons, men came to the land of Minar, dark shepherd folk with their fleecy flocks who built Thra, Larnac, and Cadatheron on the winding river Ai. And certain tribes, more hardy than the rest, pushed on the border of the lake and built Sarnath at a spot where precious metals were found in the earth. Not far from the gray city of Ib did the wandering tribes lay the first stones of Sarnath, and at the beginnings of Ib they marveled greatly. Oh, and at the beings of Ib they marveled greatly. But with their marveling was mixed hate, for they thought it not meet that... Sorry, I'm going to say it again. For they thought it not meet that beings such aspect should walk... This is a complicated sentence, sorry.
Lovecraft is like this.
Yeah. For they thought it not meet that beings of such aspect should walk about the world of men at dusk. Nor did they like the strange sculptures upon the grey monoliths of Ib, for those sculptures were terrible with great antiquity.
A kind of reminder of the ones that Danny was told were from the Shadowlands, the sculptures that are just so terrifying. I'm like, what the hell is that? Like, what? So yeah, Ib...
By the way, we have one familiar thing I just want to shout out. Thra is named here. I never knew this was a reference to Lovecraft. That's the world in the Dark Crystal. Thra.
I didn't know that.
Oh.
Yeah,
Oh, nice.
It's not with 2 A's, but it's got to be a reference.
That's pretty specific. Yeah,
Anyways.
Thra. Yeah. So, yeah, Ib and Sarnath, same spellings. That's where George got those names from. Sarnor did war with Ib for the mouth of the Sarn. So that's also, part of something George borrowed very vaguely. Also, those sculptures, like Dragonstone maybe, or the Long Bridge, which is a segue to another quote from the Doom that came to Sarnath.
The wonder of the world and the pride of all mankind was Sarnath the Magnificent. Of polished, desert-quarried marble were its walls, in height 300 cubits, and in breadth 75, so that chariots might pass each other as men drove them along the top.
That is, George borrowed that line too. If you remember, the black walls of Volantis, of polished desert quarried marble walls here, but the black walls of Volantis are shorter but broader. A cubit is 1.5 feet. So these Sarnath the Magnificent in Lovecraft stories 450 feet height, and in Volantis, I think they're 200 feet high, as indicated by Quentin when he's in Essos. Quote:
Across the wide blue expanse of the Rhoyne, he could see the black wall that had been raised by the Valyrians when Volantis was no more than an outpost of their empire. A great oval of fused stone, 200 feet high, and so thick that 6 4-horse chariots could race around its top abreast, as they did each year to celebrate the founding of the city.
So chariots passing each other or racing each other on top of a wall is a very, very similar reference. Clearly a similar idea. Back to the Doom that came to Sarnath, another quote that fits in here super nicely.
Lofty and amazing were the 17 tower-like temples of Sarnath, fashioned of a bright, multicolored stone not known elsewhere. A full 1,000 cubits high stood the greatest among them, wherein the high priests dwelt with a magnificence scarce less than that of the kings.
I want to point out that is a preposterous height.
Yes, it is.
That's taller than all the 7 wonders of the world stacked on top of each other.
That is really high. So that's 1,500 feet, which is more than twice the height of the wall of Westeros. The Lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the tallest buildings of antiquity, was 492 feet tall. So well short of that, a third, basically. Yangning Temple in China, oldest ancient Chinese tower. It's a pagoda, similar to a tower. 448 feet high, 136 meters. The Great Pyramid, 492 feet high. Same as the Lighthouse of Alexandria, 146 meters, 150 meters roughly. 40 years later, the Pyramid of Khafre, 20 feet shorter than the Great Pyramid, so slightly shorter. Tallest modern building is the Burj Khalifa. That's 2,717 feet. That is massively tall, but that's using modern techniques. So this is Lovecraft, not Sarnor, not the Sarnor of Martin's world, which did have really tall towers. Essos' Sarnath is, quote, a Sarnath of the tall towers. So he preserved the idea of the tall towers without specifying just how tall they were, whereas we do have a height here. I have to assume magic was involved here.
It would have to be continuously evolved, because just think about it for a second. I mean, that's like the Empire State Building. It's like a skyscraper. It's, so even if somehow they built that, how do they get to? Do they have elevators? Like, how do they get to the top?
Yeah, they have to use
How many flights?
stairs, the crazy stairs.
It would take you hours just to get up there. Can they
They probably
go to
have
the
lifts,
bathroom?
but
Is
not
there
that.
food?
Yeah.
How does it withstand wind? Like, it's just crazy.
Sounds
There's
like
no way that
you
could-
need to do some research on ancient towers. Like, how do they handle that? You know, I mean, if ones that were real.
Well, they only
you know?
got to like 500 feet tall.
Well-
Those are like the tallest buildings.
Well, still, I would still be curious. Like, how do they handle a toilet,
that's
an
true.
ancient toilet at 500
Yeah.
feet high? Like, you just like poop out the window and it just lands on the ground. Like, I think that is some places it did do that.
Sometimes, in some places, they would use like pulley systems, right?
Yeah, they would. Like, like those like
Yeah.
dumb waiters.
That,
those
I
existed, yeah.
specifically asked about this in terms of Casterly Rock on the inside.
Yes.
I asked George because in like the Rock of Gibraltar and in other places the Casterly Rock was like based on, they do use pulley systems. But no, he said they do not have like dumb waiters like in Casterly Rock, which I'm like, okay.
They have servants.
Yeah, they
lots
have
of servants.
just lots of servants.
Yeah.
And Castle Rock, by the way, is 3 times taller than the High Tower, even. But that's a mountain. It's
Yeah,
carved.
yeah.
It's, you know, it's an actual
But it's a mountain with
not
stuff inside. Like, so, you know,
Yeah.
like people do still logistically have to get from
Yeah.
point A to point
Yeah,
B.
you still have to go up, and even if it's not the same building
Yeah.
height challenge, it's still the logistical operations challenge is
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
It's massive.
But just quick little side note. I wonder even if this might have affected Lovecraft's writing. The big shift, like 500 feet was about like the limit of the tallest buildings until around the late 1800s, because the invention of the skyscraper, if you will, was based around. I mean, I think they also needed elevators. They also needed like other new technologies.
Yeah.
But basically, the idea was instead of the walls of the building bearing the weight, they built a steel structure, and the walls were just attached onto that rather than the walls holding the weight. And that was
Right.
like what enabled skyscrapers to be built.
Which they
But
didn't
that
have
was
steel
new. That
back
was
then.
like-
Yeah, they couldn't have had big steel
Right, that was
beams,
only
yeah.
happening in like the late like 1890s is the first time they were starting to build buildings like that, which would have been in Lovecraft's life. So he might have been inspired the potential mega heights that
Yeah.
a building could have. I don't know.
It's interesting to see like the way they use steel in stone structures. Like the Romans, for example, would make huge rocks and chisel out like a little hole in the side of each of them, and then 2 holes would line up, and then they would pour molten metal into that, and that would cool and lock the rocks together in place.
Primitive rebar.
Yeah,
almost.
exactly. It's a really
Yeah.
neat, like, oh, that's pretty clever. So yeah, you wonder like maybe some other fancy techniques were used in some of these things, but yeah, it pretty much has to be magic. Is the only real explanation.
Yeah.
That fills in the gaps. Yeah, but of course that's Lovecraft's 1,500-foot tower, not George R. Martin's. George didn't give heights for the tall towers of Sarnath. They were big, probably not that big.
But he did give some heights of some other structures that are also
Pretty huge.
pretty close and preposterous. Yeah.
George has said that the wall is probably too tall. but whatever. So that was the doom that came to Lovecraft's Sarnath. Let's talk about the actual doom that came to Sarnath, the Dothraki, which is our closing section here. And it starts with a quote.
The Confederation of Cities, later called the Kingdom of Sarnor, survived the Valyrian expansion thanks to the great plain that separated one from the other. Only for that plain and the people who occupied it, the Dothraki horse lords, to be the source of Sarnor's downfall after the doom.
So you could say that the Great Plain became a great pain.
It sure did. That works. So they took great pains to fight the people of the Great Plains. So this was the Century of Blood. So we had a lot to say in the Century of Blood episode, but we specifically said we'll leave out the Kingdom of Sarnor because it's such a huge story on its own. And as you can see, this has been a pretty long episode. And so the Kingdom of Sarnor fell in the same era. It wasn't directly because of the doom, but it was an indirect cause of the doom, you could say. It helped unleash the Dothraki, and Sarnor was their first major target, thanks to proximity. Again, Dothraki Sea, Silver Sea, all that business. So the Dothraki united under a single leader for the first time, like I said, Khal Mengo. He used the Sarnori attitude towards his own people to his advantage. Quote,
Contemptuous of the horse lords, who had been no more than a nuisance to them for centuries, the tall men ignored the threat from the east for far too long, even as the Khalasars began to raid across their eastern marches. Some of their kings even sought to use the Dothraki in their own wars, offering them gold and slaves and other gifts to fight against their rivals. Khal Mengo took these gifts gladly. Then, took the conquered lands as well, burning fields and farms and towns to return the grasslands to their wild state.
Yeah, so that's really just dancing with the devil, isn't it? They're buying the Dothraki off to go attack their rival Sarnori cities, and all the while the Dothraki are learning how to fight against the Sarnori, learning all about their lands and their leaders and their territory, and just filing all that away until...
And accumulating more wealth as the cities are bleeding out wealth.
True, good point. And that just makes more Dothraki like, ooh, this guy really he's a man to follow. Kalmengo's followers must have been grand over there because he was the first guy to unite them all. They're like, wow, this guy is really something. Maybe they thought he was a stallion that mounts the world. Maybe that's something we should talk about when we do the Dothraki episode. So the cities were picked off one by one, starting with Sathar, the waterfall city. The men were all slain, women and children enslaved. Most of them died on the march to Slaver's Bay, 3/4 of them. The World of Ice and Fire says the cities of the Sarn finally realized their peril when an event that truly shows how far gone the leadership of these cities was. Detached from reality, driven by greed, they did this, quote.
Even then, the kings of Sarnor proved unable to unite. As Sathar burned, the kings of Kasath to the west and Gornath to the north sent forth their armies, not to aid their neighbors, but to lay claim to a share of the plunder. In their greed for land, Kasath and Gornath even came into conflict with one another and fought a pitched battle 3 days' ride west of Sathar as plumes of black smoke rose in the eastern sky.
So the Dothraki come, destroy one of the major Sarnori cities, and the two nearest by Sarnori cities just go fight over the ruins, like as if, this is no big deal. Let's go get some loot. Like this isn't going to be a problem.
Too bad for them.
Yeah,
but, yeah.
So wow. So now it's again back to what I said at the beginning, how I introduced this topic. They're not only are they not uniting against an existential threat, which is bad enough, they're fighting each other during it. It's not only are they failing to ally, but they're fighting each other. It sounds a lot like the War of Five Kings with the others looming. Except at least in that case, the Five Kings don't know the others are looming. They at least have that excuse. In this case, the others, imagine if the others had already destroyed Winterfell or White Harbor, and people are still like, let's see if we can bring them on our side.
By the way, you can imagine Cersei and Euron would be like that.
I can. Yes, you're right. I can, in fact, imagine.
Maybe one of those, contenders of the Five Kings, might do the right thing. Maybe one of them. I don't know. Maybe Stannis might.
Yeah, maybe. And this is a really important example because the Dothraki are coming to Westeros. How are the High Lords going to react to this? We've brought it up many times as well. It won't be good. They won't react positively to it. They're basically the equivalent of the Sarnori kings, not the High King, but like the individual High Lords, are basically have a similar level of power to, Lord Lannister, Lord Baratheon, all these things. Will they continue to fight each other while the Dothraki run free in Dany's name, or will they unite kind of untrustingly and not very effectively, or will they unite and still lose because the Dothraki are just too strong, too overwhelming, and they've got a dragon or 3 helping them? I mean, it doesn't look good for Westeros in that regard. I don't think they're going to beat Daenerys' armies, and I don't think they would beat her army even if it was just the Dothraki until they learn how to fight Dothraki. If they have the chance, the first opportunity, the Dothraki will have the edge going into that. They will have a better battle plan, better preparation. More prepared, more understanding of what's going on. Yeah, but so it's hard to predict, but we can guess it will not go well. So maybe some of the lessons of the Sarnori will be learned very difficultly by, it's not a word, by the Westerosi as well. How does that strike you, Sean, comparing the fall of the Sarnori cities to the Dothraki to what might come in Westeros when the Dothraki arrive there as well?
I don't straight up disagree with you, but I'm not as confident because they gotta get there first.
Yeah,
and they might not be properly equipped or fed.
Might be too cold. Yeah, who knows?
Yeah, some areas maybe not, right? Like if they're in the Reach, or that's not necessarily. But might be colder if winter's coming.
True. It's easy to look at that battle on TV, the battle of the loot train battle or whatever, and say, "Oh, it's just going to be a slaughter." Yeah. Maybe it will, but that they just the show just wanted to do a big battle and show it be really cool and just have spectacle.
Like there's other things too that George might actually account for the Dothraki might come across there and become diseased because they're not used to the germs that exist in Westeros, or vice versa.
Good
They
point.
might bring over
Good point.
the same plague that's hitting Marine. They might bring with them too.
Yeah, the pale
That's
man.
a significant factor. That it might not be exciting reading. You know what I mean? It might not be what audiences are hoping for. So
Yeah.
maybe he won't deal with it as much, but it would be a factor, I think, in reality.
I like that
there's
disease
also-
idea. I've talked about that a lot. It's something I think is going to be a big deal, not just grayscale, but other things. I think some analysts of our fandom out there think it won't be a big deal. I disagree. And we'll see. Obviously, it's up to George,
Yeah.
but this is so that's part of why I like your idea here, because it fits with
From like
that.
a logistical, realistic standpoint, I feel like it should be. From an entertainment standpoint, I can understand why it might
We'll
not be.
see. Yeah.
On top of that, though, another factor is that, and again, there's a lot. When you're talking about the Dothraki, right, you're talking about scores of thousands of people. And even if they are of a similar culture, there's still going to be a lot of diversity within them, just the difference in their generations. And think about what it will take, even if they get united behind Dany and earn all the dragons and take up this cause. The fact is, some are going to be more or less excited about crossing an ocean. There's got to be some contingency. They're like,
Yeah.
nope, we're just not going to do that.
Yeah.
And then once they do, it might be a life-changing event that makes them wholeheartedly, the ones that were willing to do it in the first place, and now that they make it across, might be even more committed to Dany than ever. But there's going to be some contingency that's like, a whole new land? We can do what we want over here. And Dany's like, all right, at this time, go to this place and fight these. Like, screw you,
Yeah.
we're
Some of them
going
might
over
do
here.
their own
Like,
thing. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah. So they might win those first few battles, maybe even easily, but that might encourage them more to go off and do their own thing, to become more scattered, more difficult to control.
Oh, these people are easy to
I don't know.
beat.
It depends.
Why
Yeah.
do we
Like,
need the dragon? I can just defeat them.
yeah.
Yeah.
I could see that. It might be, if anything keeps them all in line, it could be just this whole thing has religious significance. That they think if they truly see her as the stallion that mounts the world, but even there still would be exceptions probably.
Yeah, not everyone
Yeah.
is a devotee of religion. And yeah,
have
that doesn't even
that is the thing
that
that I
doesn't
think
even
we
account
both.
for.
Oh, God, we keep talking.
You go ahead.
That is the thing I think that Aziz and I've expressed so many times that we want out of the Winds of Winter and A Dream of Spring is some Dothraki. Like, we want to see this variety within the Dothraki culture. We want to see some of them struggling with their beliefs, or all of this culture class. Any of this would be interesting.
We won't get a POV, but we will hopefully get more than we've gotten. That'd be nice to see.
It's not hard to get more.
Yeah.
And just imagine the effect that journey will have. Like, just some of them will get seasick if there's a storm, if a ship sinks, and then they get there and their population is decimated by some disease. They might start to question Dany. Their religion, fervor might not last. If they do lose a battle in there somewhere, like it could fall apart for Dany. You start off saying you feel like they have the advantage, and I think I agree with you. But I don't know if they have a clear, obvious, definite advantage the whole way.
Yeah, you could see how the advantage would fall off. Like you agree with the initial advantage, but maybe that advantage doesn't hold over the long term. They may learn how to fight the Dothraki. They may stop. Yeah.
Plus, a lot of times combat is about knowing the land, and
they don't know.
They don't know
home
the
field
land.
advantage.
They don't know it at all.
Very
They don't, not even remotely.
Some areas, like the Dothraki in the Rainwood, that they're not going to be riding their horses around, galloping around in the deep jungles of the near jungles of the Rainwood, for example.
I think we're coming up onto a discussion of this also, but it's probably not exactly in the Dothraki's comfort zone to besiege cities. If the Westerosi just pull behind big walls, charging cavalry doesn't help very much, and restless soldiers in a foreign land might not just hang around.
Well, that's why you got the dragon, at least. Then you bring the dragon out.
Yeah, there is
burn
that.
the gates open for them. Yeah, give them blow that door down.
Pretty much.
So, continuing with the fall of the cities, we left off here a minute ago with the fall of Sathar, and so look what happens next. It's not only did they gather and just fight over spoils, Gornath then joins with Khal Mengo. The king of Gornath marries one of Khal Mengo's daughters and assists them in fighting Kasath to destroy Kasath. Like, what are you thinking? That didn't go well. 12 years later, Gornath fell too. I forget if it was the same call or the next call to take over, Khal Moro, and the Dothraki wife of that king just killed him. Just like, this guy's too weak. She despised him for his weakness and killed him. It was kind of like what Ygritte said. It's like, what if your husband is abusive and weak or whatever? It's like, well, you kill him in his sleep. This one may not have waited for him to be asleep. She may have just walked up and was like,
yeah, I kind of think of Viserys here.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
A king, killed for his weakness by the Dothraki when they presumably had an alliance.
I'm making stupid decisions. You're right.
Yeah,
Alliance with the Dothraki. Great
yeah.
parallel.
Yeah.
Good call. Yeah, I like that. And here's how it proceeded after, so 12 years after Sath, Gornath fell. And then here's how it went from there. Hint, not well. Quote.
One by one, the remaining cities of the tall men were overwhelmed and destroyed, leaving only ruins and ashes to mark where their proud towers once stood. For scholars and students of history, the fall of Salosh by the Silver Shore was especially tragic, for when that city of scholars burned, its great library was not spared, and most of the history of the tall men and the peoples who had gone before them were lost for all time. Kith and Hornoth soon followed, destroyed by rival calls, each of whom sought to outdo the other in savagery.
So the Sarnori cities tried to outdo each other in glory and wealth, which made their fall all the greater as the Khals tried to outdo each other in savagery in destroying them. Imagine the literal fall of all those tall towers, for example. Like, they were brought down. They collapsed. And think of how big they were and just the spectacle of that. The Dothraki probably really enjoyed it. Try not to think about that with Old Town and Euron again. I keep going back to that. It's like the tower, the Old Town Citadel collapsing or something, or the High Tower collapsing. Like, yikes. We have an example of a tower falling that we've seen. It's not a huge tower, but the Tower of the Hand was brought down by Cersei. And that was, maybe a little foreshadowing for other towers. Who knows? So yeah, you mentioned, why don't they just stay inside? Why don't they just stay behind their walls? Well, for one thing, it's cowardly. It looks cowardly, looks bad for like a warrior culture. They would be like, no, we got to go face the enemy. It's also not as normal as we might think. Pericles did this in the Peloponnesian War. He was like, we can't beat the Spartans on land. We just can't. They're just going to beat us if we fight them face to face. So we're not going to. Athens has really tall walls. If they want to go out there and wreck all our farms, let them. We'll go hit them where they're not. We'll go take our ships and hit them where they're not. And it was working for a while, but people got mad at Pericles because some people didn't like it. And then the plague hit Athens, and staying inside became a really bad idea. Pericles died of the plague. So it didn't end up working, but it was a workable strategy. It just went belly up because of the plague and other things.
Yeah, it may have worked. You're being results oriented because of other factors.
Absolutely,
it
could have
might have been sound.
Could have worked. Yeah. The Fabian strategy versus Hannibal was Hannibal. Like, the Romans kept fighting Hannibal, and he kept beating them. So eventually, the Fabian strategy was to not fight him, just to not meet him in the field. It was very controversial. The Romans were like, "What? We always march and face our enemies head on." So for a while, his sub-commanders were like, they were so angry. They were like, get him, attack him. And he's like, nope, we're not doing that. And eventually they started to get in line and follow his lead because they saw that it was working.
It's not like he didn't do anything. He was attacking their supply lines.
Yes.
He was using guerrilla warfare, basically.
Hannibal was going around taking cities and flipping them to Carthage. And Fabian would just follow behind him and flip those cities back. Yeah.
And Hannibal's farther away from resupply and support, and so they
wore him down. Yeah,
Fabian is not. So it's just a matter of time before Fabian's. In the meantime, the people of the land are suffering.
Yes,
right? Their towns are being destroyed.
Farms are being destroyed. Yeah, exactly.
But it sucks. But it was the best option.
Yeah, it was like that.
In the big picture.
It required that patience. It required keeping the impatient people from getting uprising or whatever. But yeah, so, and if we have things like the city of caravans, like they trade depending on trade. I mean, they can still do river trade, I assume, but if you got, those aren't caravans, right? So they need their income relies on being able to go out and send out caravans. The Dothraki are destroying their caravans. Well, that's not sustainable. But Mardosh, the Unconquerable, did do this. They were like, okay, well, all the other cities met them in the field. That didn't work. Let's try something else. They held out for 6 years under siege, began starving. They charged out. They killed all their own families, kind of like the Shave Pate says he would do if Danny's armies are beaten and the slavers are going to take over again. He's like, well, I'll just kill my own family, not let them be enslaved, and then try to kill as many of them before they kill me. And this is what they did. They killed all their own families so they wouldn't be enslaved, and then charged out the gate and just died fighting, trying to take as many Dothraki as they could. The Dothraki renamed the city of the Blood Charge. It's one of the few names that was somewhat like not denigrating. They were like, okay, these guys, they were warriors here. So Mardash did kind of live up to its name, even though they lost. So those guys showed courage. They were still greedy and corrupt, probably like a lot of the other cities, but that was that. Nina writes, compare Dany's forces facing the slaver army in A Dance with Dragons and Into the Winds of Winter. Barristan counsels Dany to bring battle to her enemies on a field of his own choosing instead of starving during an extended siege. Remember, he's in that position, and they're having plague inside the city, so it's kind of similar to what we said with Pericles, where maybe it's better to wait, but not if there's plague. Eating stuff like, we got to take our chances now to attack and break the siege and get some fresh water and stuff in here. The Sarnori, Nina says, the Sarnori enjoy both a huge numerical advantage and believed they enjoyed a personnel advantage. So that's another thing that's important to note. The Dothraki were actually a smaller army. Even with 4 Khalasars merged together, the Sarnori outnumbered them, which is, again, a reminder of the comparison to Persia, where Alexander's army was way smaller than the Persian Empire that he was invading. The armies that he faced sometimes were like 5 times larger than his. But his men were just better led. They weren't slaves. A lot of these were slave soldiers that, didn't have morale, heavier armor, heavier cavalry, just a lot of superiority in terms of the individual troops.
Better trained, better equipped, better morale.
Yeah, better everything. Yeah, pretty much.
Each one of those is like 2-1, 3-1, 4-1. You can still win.
Yeah, like Alexander leads his men charging directly at their king, and that king runs away. Like, okay, who's the stronger? All right, the king ran away. Everybody's like, okay, well, if he's running away, aren't we going to run away too? Well, yes, they all started running away, like 200,000 of them or something. So the last High King, Mazor Alexei, was like, all right, y'all, finally, we need to put an end to this. Let's gather a huge army at the capital of Sarnath. Everybody come, meet beneath the walls, and then let's go fight them. But again, he's like, let's fight them out in the field. There's a battle called the Field of Crows. We'll go into greater detail about the Field of Crows when we do the Dothraki episode, because it was their tactics that were more interesting. Basically, Mazor Alexei fell into a trap, the kind of trap that we've seen throughout history so many times. People fall for the feigned route, basically. And Nina says, kind of reminds me of the legends of Constantine the 11th, who supposedly died during the last fighting during the conquest of Constantinople. Yeah, kind of similar. Mazor Alexei dies himself along with several other kings on the battlefield. The aftermath was predictable. Quote,
bereft of defenders, Sarnath of the Tall Towers fell to Loso the Lame less than a fortnight later. Not even the palace with 1,000 rooms was spared when the Khal Loso put the city to the torch. The remaining cities of the grasslands followed one by one as the century of blood drew to its close.
And so does our episode. In the end, it can almost be said that the people of Sarnor were destroyed by that which they once were. Their ancestors were not terribly dissimilar to the Dothraki, living in conditions that were similar reverence for nature, horse people, grasslands. A lake is the cradle of their civilization. The Dothraki believe they all come from the lake beneath the mother of mountains. Like the first Dothraki came out of the lake riding a horse. By the time that the Dothraki got to the city of Sar East, which remember, Sar East, Sath West, they destroyed that as well. But most of the people had fled. They were like, there's no way, there's no hope. They just disappeared. They ran away to various places, scattered, which had a similar effect of basically dispersing the culture of the Sarnori so much that there's almost nothing left, which leads to our final quote, one that tells us the state of Sarnor in current times.
Only in Sath do men still name themselves Tagays Fen. Fewer than 20,000 remain, when once the tall men numbered in the millions. Only there are the 100 gods of the kingdom of Sarnor still worshipped. The bronze and marble likenesses that once adorned the streets and temples of the tall men now lean crookedly, overgrown by weeds, along the grassy ways of Vaes Dothrak, the sacred city of the horse lords.
That's a great outro quote, isn't it? Good job, George. That's some good writing there, George. Some other specific details of the fall of Sarnori cities we'll have when we talk about the Dothraki, because, of course, they were the main target of them. We will do a Dothraki episode soon enough, especially if you join your fellow Westorians in voting for them in the next poll and for whatever other topics you want to see in future episodes of Valar Rereadis. I guess you could say the episode is inevitable. The Dothrakian episode is inevitable as they are. This Dornish Dame says, and on the other side of the Narrow Sea, kind of around the same time as Viserys is named Khal Ragat, you also have Robert riding south to King's Landing on his horse, cursing Cersei's wheelhouse. Great point. Yeah, he's that damnable wheelhouse. If I have to stop on it one more time, he's so mad. Yeah. That's a fantastic catch, Dornish Dame. Amanda Molyneux sends a super chat. Appreciate that, Amanda. A very supportive patron there, sending a little extra. We appreciate you. Our trivia question, remember, it was, the free folk of the frozen shore ride chariots made primarily from the bones of what animal?
Walrus.
Walrus. Cuckoo.
And some people did get that in the chat.
Cool.
People guessed seal, whales.
That for sure was chipmunk.
But the first person to get it was Arston Whitebread, who guessed walrus, but also Lynn Neal, Archmaester Emma, Dornish Dame. A bunch of people guessed walrus.
Cool. Yeah. I think some of the questions maybe been a notch too hard. I tried to make it slightly easier. This is still a tough question. That's a tough one, but trying to find my way, you know.
I'm glad no one guessed cat, by the way.
Yeah, me too. I'm glad that as well. So we mentioned our When Giants Roamed episode, and we mentioned our Nymeria series somewhat indirectly by talking about the Rhoynar quite a bit. But the Nymeria, especially the first Nymeria episode, is all about the cities of the Rhoyne, the lead up to them leaving Mother Rhoyne. That is the name of the episode. So I recommend that one as well for related topics.
I recommend our... do we have the many... We do have Many-Faced Azor Ahai up somewhere, right? I always forget. I always recommend it, and then I feel like it's not actually out or something.
It is up. I think it's patron only.
Okay. Anyways, if you're a patron, I feel like it's a good pairing with this one.
It might not be. I forget. We have so many episodes. I don't recall.
We do. I'm gonna look it up.
It does exist, though. It was a panel, y'all. It's not a normal episode. It was a panel Shay and I did.
Okay, it comes up. It's on. When I Google it, it comes up on YouTube and on podcast form.
Okay, so you don't need to be a patron to see that one. It's like 45 minutes.
It's a panel, so yeah, it's short. It's 40 minutes, you know.
But we had like quotes and some good discussion and some good questions that people came from the audience, and so yeah.
But we talk a lot about the idea of these Azor Ahai figures, which we touched on here, and all that, and Sarnor. So
we've got Jet.
Oh, we do have Jet today. Yay!
So online with these kitties here, because this cat is all black, named Jet.
Jet said goodbye already.
We are feeding an all black cat stray that comes to our house. It comes to the backyard fairly often. I feed them almost every day. And our friend Joe, who is occasionally in the chat, he comes to the game stream sometimes. He's been my friend for like a super long time, over 20 years. I was best man in his wedding. He is currently walking the Appalachian Trail. That might ring a bell. I think I've mentioned that on the show. His wife...
It's taken him 6 months to do it.
Yeah,
Not like he's taking him longer, but that's how long it takes to do it.
Yeah. He started on his 50th birthday, and he's going all the way. Yeah, so it's going to take 6 months. You're right. So that was March 15th. So he's a month in now, and it's cool. So his wife took in a stray cat while he's been gone, and the cat was pregnant. And the cat has had 3 kittens very recently, and one of them is all black, one of them is like gray brown, and one of them is a tuxedo cat. And I'm excited to see their journey. She's documenting it really well, like with their weights and everything. So maybe I'll share that with you all as well every once in a while, how those little 3 kittens are doing.
She must have had them very recently in the past week, right?
Yes, their eyes just opened like 2 days ago.
Yeah.
She came home. It was amazing. She came home and they had been born, and the mother had cleaned them all up and everything. It was like all the mess was gone and everything. It was just like she came home and there's 3 kittens just nursing, like all cleaned up. She was like, oh, wow, good job, Mom. I mean, if some cats have like 8 kittens, which 3 is a little more manageable. So,
yeah.
Anyway, we love cats. That's the bottom line here. They've made it into our show regularly, both in discussion form and visual form. Mm-hmm. So pet your cats for us, and we'll say thanks to everyone who does that.
Yeah.
So again, shout out to TV Tropes for helping me out with some of the research today. Some of the notes were really helpful. Thanks to anyone who came live to support the live stream experience. We love having you all here for that. It's great to engage with live discussion, adding comments, answering the trivia question. It's really fun. And I appreciate you all's presence. Thanks to Nina for her great takes, lots of great notes, lots of great research. Thanks to you all who've signed up on Patreon to make this financially feasible for all of us. It is a blessing and a privilege to be able to do this for a living. Thanks to Joey, Jesse, and Kevin for our music. Thanks to Michael Klarfeld for the video intro and the maps behind, which were particularly useful as always. And thanks to our mods on our various social media platforms who are helping run things. Particular thanks to Laura for helping me run the AMA we did in Facebook last week. So that's another reason to join our Facebook group for AMAs and stuff like that.
Yeah,
Sean, what do you have something to say?
I'm just excited to meet people at Ice and Fire Con.
Yeah.
It's coming right up. I hope you guys are all excited. And also, I'm kind of hoping to like piece together names and faces. I don't know. There's probably some people who I know, but I won't recognize you, you know? So anyway, please, I'm approachable. Like, come say hi to me.
Sean is approachable.
Hopefully I'll remember who you are and we can interact and it'll bring the community closer together.
Yeah, you know what event I particularly recommend? I don't know if you've done it before, Sean, is there's the Icebreakers round where at the con, they have two different ones. One is in the morning. I won't be at that one, but one is in the afternoon. And it's just like they do games kind of like an office, you know, where you put like something on your forehead and then you have to guess like what character you are, and like, you know, you meet people that way and you get
This
talking.
is something scheduled at Ice and Fire
It's
Con?
called Icebreakers. Yeah, I go every year, and they always have one early in the morning, like on the first day, and then they have one like 2 p.m. or something on like either way. It's on the schedule. It's called Icebreakers round 1 and Icebreakers round 2, and you'll get to do little interactive games where you meet people, and I highly recommend it.
Cool. And last but not least, shout out to our friends at Here Be Dragons covering Spider-Man No Way Home today.
You're starting right now, I guess. It's 6 o'clock exactly.
And Sean, one last thing.
Better Call Saul's coming out.
Yeah.
I hope everyone's watching that. If you happen to be a fan of that, I'm a super fan of that.
Are you gonna cover
Let
it,
me know
Sean?
if you want to talk about it.
Or do you think,
I don't know.
I'm not covering either. It's like so weird considering it's like Sean and my usually like our number one show of the year. Every year that Better Call Saul is on, it's the number one show for us. Like that we rank.
Yeah, I think it's in my top 5 all-time greatest shows.
Yeah, so like it's weird to not cover it.
Currently running
but
show, and
really sometimes it's like, what is there to say? Like it's amazing. It's so good.
Yeah.
No critique.
My friend Eric, honestly, that's one reason I'm a little hesitant to cover it, because I don't know if I'm I feel like it's greater than I am. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah.
like,
No, it does.
but my friend Eric, the one that made a movie, he actually has another movie that he's made that's coming out just because of COVID and everything. They couldn't get it distributed. I mean, it's like an indie horror movie anyway, but it's coming out on DVD next week.
Oh.
So he's got a lot of activity going on with that. But he wants to cover Better Call Saul with me. He has like a game stream that he does, and it's kind of small. And he does it. It's kind of like a weird thing. He has like this anime Fox persona. That he does it on Twitch or whatever. And but he wants me to come on and talk about Better Call Saul with him. But we just can't do it in this next week or two because of Ice and Fire Con and his movie coming out. But we might try to do it after that. I'll see how it goes.
Okay, cool. Well, stay tuned for that, folks. We'll try to let you know what Sean's up to. If he does get into that, we'll show you where to find it and what links if that does emerge. But until next time, everybody.
Until not next Sunday. Not next week,
time, not next Sunday.
Yes.
But we will post that. Like I said, I will post the chapter. Video.
Yeah.
That'll be awesome. See all the great work done by the Bengineer and the great voice actors who participated.
Good. Alt-Shift-X is the narrator for it.
Alt-Shift-X is the narrator. How cool is that?
Yeah.
So, folks, look out for that. And we'll see you soon for more Valar Rereadis.